There exists in naval history a peculiar kind of moment, one where an entire future narrows down to a single choice, a single command, a single decision to move or wait or strike. And yet the men who lived through it could never quite agree afterward on what they felt in that compressed space between certainty and catastrophe. June 1944, the Philippine Sea, a fleet gathering in the gathering dusk. Picture the wooden deck of a Japanese aircraft carrier, let us say the Taiho, though the feeling would be much the same across the others. The sun is descending toward the horizon, in shades of amber and bruised orange, and the salt air carries within it that particular weight that comes before great events. You can smell it if you imagine carefully enough. Not just the tang of seawater and diesel fuel, but something else beneath, something like anticipation, hanging suspended in the humid darkness. The carrier's engines maintain their steady, almost meditative hum, a vibration that passes up through the soles of boots, through the bones, a constant companion that had become invisible to those who served aboard. The flight deck, vast and geometric, lies nearly empty in this hour. Most of the aircraft are below decks in the hangars, being prepared, being blessed in some cases, being fueled and loaded with ordnance by crews whose faces had grown lean and serious over months of diminishing margins. Above them, suspended in the open air, the island structure rises like a dark tower, and within its narrow windows, lights glow pale and artificial against the fading natural light. Radio operators sit hunched over their instruments. Signalmen stand ready with their flags. Officers confer in hushed, careful voices. But what strikes anyone attempting to reconstruct this moment, and this is perhaps the true puzzle that makes this hour worth lingering upon, is the quality of the quiet, not silence, never true silence on a warship where so much mechanical life persists. Rather, it was a kind of restraint, a collective holding of breath. The men who moved across those decks, who climbed the narrow ladders and passed through the steel corridors below, who sat in the dimly lit ready rooms waiting for orders that had not yet come, they knew something was imminent. They had received messages. They had listened to the rumors that always moved through a fleet like bioluminescent fish through dark water. The Americans had landed on Saipan. The decision had been made. The mobile fleet, Japan's last great concentration of naval power, was about to move northeastward toward a confrontation that would decide, in some fundamental way, the trajectory of this war in the Pacific. And yet uncertainty persists, even now, about what most of these men truly believed would happen. Did they hold faith in victory? Did they sense, with that uncanny prescience that sometimes visits those about to face devastation, that something irreversible was beginning? The historical record offers fragments, contradictions, letters written but never sent, accounts given decades later to interviewers whose questions may have shaped the answers. What we can say with certainty is this: they were afraid. Not all of them, perhaps. Some were young enough, or trained deeply enough, to believe in the righteousness of their cause and the skill of their commanders. But dread, a quiet, almost polite dread, that seems to have moved among the fleet like evening fog settling on dark water. If you have ever wondered what it feels like to stand at the edge of history while it is still being written, while the outcome remains genuinely obscure and the machines around you hum with potential energy, you might find something worth following in the hours and days that are about to unfold. And so if you find yourself drawn to this particular story, the story of Japan's mobile fleet in its final great gamble, told not from the perspective of victory or even of well-documented defeat, but from the lived experience of those who served aboard these carriers and who faced decisions that no amount of courage or sacrifice would ultimately alter, then please consider subscribing to follow this narrative all the way through to its difficult, illuminating end. For now, though, remain with us on that darkening deck as evening deepens into true night. The hum continues, the preparations continue, the dread, unnamed and unspoken, continues as well. And somewhere beyond the horizon, in ways that no message or radio transmission or intuition could yet convey, the forces that would determine the fate of this fleet are already moving into position, already zeroing in, already beginning the long mechanical process of destruction. The sun sinks lower, the engines hum on, and we drift, as these men drifted, in that strange suspension between the world as it was and the world as it was about to become. A space so narrow it cannot quite be measured in hours or minutes, but only in the slow accumulation of breath and heartbeat and the weight of choices already made by men with stars on their uniforms and empires balanced on their shoulders. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to command the last fleet that might change everything, to stand on the bridge of a carrier, knowing that within days the ocean itself will render judgment on whether your strategy was brilliant or merely brave, then you understand the weight that Admiral Ozawa carried into these waters in the summer of 1944. The story we're about to trace together is not one of victory. It is something more complex, more human, more worthy of sustained attention. It is the account of a navy trying to do the impossible with what remained, of men who understood the mathematics of their own defeat, but pressed forward anyway, guided by training, duty, and a faith in something larger than themselves. For those drawn to the intimate mechanics of how empires break and how the ocean preserves the memory of their breaking, I'd ask you to follow along with us here. Subscribe to stay with this saga across the weeks ahead as we move deeper into the decisions and silences that shaped not just one battle, but the final chapter of Japan's naval dominance in the Pacific. This is a story best told slowly, in the dark, where the weight of each detail settles properly into understanding. The journey we're about to take together is not a recitation of dates and tactical diagrams. It is the lived experience of officers and sailors and pilots who awoke on morning after morning in June 1944, knowing that their mission was vital, and suspecting, though perhaps not admitting even to themselves, that vital missions were no longer enough to alter the trajectory of war. The fleet that sailed toward the Marianas in 1944 was not the fleet that had struck Pearl Harbor. It was not even the fleet that had fought at Midway 2 years earlier, when pilots still returned with stories and experience to pass on to the next generation. This was a fleet already thinned by attrition, by pilot losses that could not be replaced, by an industrial base that could manufacture ships and engines and wings but could never again manufacture the thousands of hours of flight training that separated a veteran aviator from a green recruit. And yet they sailed. What draws us to this particular moment in the Pacific War, when so many moments might claim our attention, is the peculiar and poignant quality of it. Here was a command structure that had to decide whether to commit its remaining carriers, its dwindling aviation corps, and its remaining trained pilots to a gamble that might reverse the course of the war, or whether to hold back and preserve what remained for some future battle that might never come. There is a kind of quiet desperation in that calculation. There is also a kind of nobility, however we choose to interpret nobility, across the distance of 80 years. The Japanese Navy that prepared for what became known as the Battle of the Philippine Sea was operating from a position we might describe as informed pessimism. The strategic situation in the Pacific had been deteriorating for months. The Americans were advancing island by island, establishing airfields, building supply lines, moving their enormous industrial capacity steadily westward. The Japanese homeland itself was no longer untouchable. American bombers had already begun to strike at Japanese cities. And yet, from the perspective of the Japanese Naval Command, there remained one avenue through which the war might still be influenced, still be shaped in ways that could matter. That avenue was naval air power. That avenue required a final, decisive fleet engagement. What makes this story so absorbing and so suited to the kind of careful, reflective attention that this form of documentary allows us to bring is the way it illuminates the constraints under which real people make decisions that will echo through history. Admiral Ozawa and his staff were not delusional. They understood American material superiority. They knew their own limitations, but they also knew that their nation had committed enormous resources to this war, that their emperor had chosen this path, and that officers did not simply decide to preserve themselves. Officers fought, and in fighting, sometimes they fought with grace, and sometimes with desperation, but they fought. The mobile fleet that was about to sortie from its bases represented the last hope of the Japanese Navy, and perhaps more importantly, it represented a kind of culmination. Everything that had happened in the Pacific War up to this point, every tactical decision, every lesson learned in blood, every gradual tightening of American dominance, all of it flowed into these few days in June when the fleet would venture forth for what everyone in a position to understand the full situation would have recognized, perhaps not consciously, but in the deeper registers of their being, as a final gamble. The men who crewed these ships, who sat in the cockpits of Zero fighters and Val dive bombers, who worked in the engine rooms and the ammunition magazines, and the radio compartments below the decks, were not so different from any other men who have ever been asked to serve in a war. They wanted to go home. They wanted to survive. But they also understood themselves to be part of something larger, something that transcended their individual desires. Whether that something was worth the price they were about to pay is a question that historians continue to debate, and rightfully so. But what is not debatable is that they were about to pay it, and that the ocean would remember. In the hours before the battle began, there was a quality to the waiting that we can glimpse through the records that survived, through the letters that were written and sometimes posted home, through the diaries and the after-action reports, and the survivor testimonies that were gathered in the years after the war. It was not panic, it was not resignation, exactly, though resignation was certainly present in some measure. It was something more like a kind of focused attention, a narrowing of consciousness to the immediate task, a concentration of will. Men prayed. Men wrote letters they knew they might not want their families to receive, and letters they hoped would be treasured. Men cleaned their equipment and checked their instruments, and made sure everything was as ready as it could be. And somewhere in the fleet, moving through the darkness of the Philippine Sea in those June nights, there were American submarines already in position, waiting, watching, silent as ghosts, knowing what was coming before the Japanese fleet itself had fully committed to the course. The collision between these forces, between the Japanese hope and the American reality, between the spiritual certainties of Yamato Damashi and the material certainties of industrial production and pilot training and superior radar, this collision was now inevitable. And we are about to witness it, slowly, carefully, with attention paid to every human dimension of what happened when these great forces met. By the spring of 1944, the Japanese Empire had begun to resemble a map drawn in vanishing ink. What had seemed, only 2 years before, like an unstoppable tide across the Pacific, territory claimed from the Philippines to the Gilbert Islands, from Wake to the Solomon Sea, had stalled, contracted, and now retreated in measured, painful increments. The question that haunted Tokyo's war rooms was no longer how much of the Pacific Japan might claim, but whether the homeland itself could be held. The loss at Midway in June of 1942 had marked the turning point, though few admitted it openly at the time. 4 of Japan's finest carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had been sent to the bottom by American dive bombers in a single, catastrophic morning. More than the ships themselves, what sank that day was Japanese naval superiority. The Americans, by contrast, had learned to absorb losses and rebuild. The shipyards of California and Pennsylvania hummed day and night with a productivity that seemed almost supernatural to Japanese observers who understood, in their quieter moments, that their nation could never match such industrial capacity. For every ship Japan built, America launched 3. For every pilot trained, America trained 5. Then came Guadalcanal, stretching from August 1942 through early 1943, a grinding, attritional nightmare that bled the Japanese Navy of resources and men in a campaign that ultimately failed. The waters around that island became a graveyard for destroyers and transports. The air losses were staggering. And perhaps most crucially, they were irrecoverable. Each pilot lost was a veteran with years of experience that could not be instantly replaced by the next class of recruits. Japan's training pipelines, unlike America's, could not churn out skilled aviators in the quantities needed to sustain such losses. By 1944, Japan's empire had shrunk to something resembling a defensive perimeter. The Mariana Islands, the Caroline Islands, the Philippines. These were no longer conquests to be celebrated, but lines to be held at any cost. The Americans were systematically reducing each island fortress, moving westward with a patience born of certainty. In the eyes of Japanese strategists, time had become the enemy. Every month that passed, American strength accumulated. Every month of delay saw more American ships launched, more American pilots trained, more American bases established. It was from this calculus of desperation that Operation Ago was born. The name itself carried a sort of philosophical weight. Ago, a Japanese term for a supreme decisive encounter, a final reckoning. The plan, conceived in Tokyo and refined by Admiral Ozawa and his staff, rested on a single gamble, that one final, enormous naval engagement, fought under the right conditions and with the right tactics, might reverse the trajectory of the war. If Japan could draw the American fleet into waters where Japanese pilots had an advantage in range, if Japanese aircraft could strike first and strike hard, destroying American carriers before their pilots could respond, then perhaps the momentum might yet swing back. Perhaps the Americans might negotiate. Perhaps Japan might buy time. This was not irrational thinking, though in hindsight it carries the weight of fantasy. It was the desperate reasoning of men facing an impossible situation, searching for the thread of possibility that might lead to survival. The Japanese Navy had always believed in the decisive battle, the one glorious engagement where superior tactics and warrior spirit might overcome material advantage. Every cadet in the Naval Academy had been taught this doctrine, and if there had ever been a moment when such a philosophy might be tested, it would be now, when the alternative was a slow, inexorable retreat toward home. The shrinking empire meant that Japan no longer had the luxury of choosing its battlegrounds. The Americans were coming to the Marianas. American troops were landing on Saipan, and so the decision was made. The mobile fleet, what remained of Japan's great carrier force, would sail east and meet them. There was no other choice. Retreat was no longer possible, not politically, not strategically, not spiritually. The honor of the Navy demanded a response. The survival of the nation, the reasoning went, might depend on what happened in the waters near Guam and Saipan in the coming weeks. What neither Tokyo nor the fleet commanders fully reckoned with, though some surely suspected, was the magnitude of the gap that had opened between Japanese capability and American capability in those 2 years since Midway. The industrial advantage was obvious, measurable in numbers of ships and aircraft, but there was something deeper, a transformation in American naval warfare that had accumulated through practice and adjustment, and the brutal lessons of each engagement. American radar had improved dramatically. American damage control had become almost an art form. American pilots, while younger and sometimes less individually skilled than their Japanese counterparts, now flew in formations that emphasized mutual protection and coordinated firepower in ways the Japanese had been slower to adapt. And American aircraft production, combined with training programs that could produce replacement pilots at a rate Japan could barely fathom, meant that the Americans could absorb losses in ways Japan could not. The question that seemed to linger in the minds of those who prepared the fleet for departure was whether any battle, however skillfully fought, could overcome such a fundamental imbalance. Could warrior spirit and superior tactics still matter when the enemy had twice as many ships, 3 times as many pilots, and an industrial machine that seemed to produce supplies and replacement personnel in quantities that defied rational calculation? In the long, quiet nights before the fleet set sail, men who had spent their careers in the Navy must have wrestled with this question, even if they could not voice it aloud. The answer, history would soon reveal, was no, but that revelation still lay ahead, hidden in the future like a shape beneath deep water. The man who would orchestrate this final gamble stood in the quiet geography of command, removed from the salt spray and the hum of engines that filled the lower decks. Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo was 56 years old, a career officer who had navigated the treacherous waters of Imperial Japanese naval politics for decades, watching younger men burn bright and vanish, watching the war transform from conquest into something closer to mathematics. He bore the weight of a fleet that existed now more in ambition than in certainty, and yet he had been chosen for this moment because he possessed something rarer than firepower. In 1944, he still believed in the possibility of decisive victory. The plan that bore his strategic vision carried the designation Operation Ago, a name that meant little to those who were not privy to the sealed briefings and the carefully marked charts in the admiral's quarters. But Ago represented far more than a mere tactical redeployment. It was the distillation of everything Japan's naval establishment still hoped to accomplish in the Pacific, all of it compressed into a single roll of the dice, a confrontation timed and positioned to create what strategists called a moment of overwhelming advantage. The philosophy behind it rested on an assumption that many in the Japanese Navy had come to accept as almost intuitive by the middle of 1944, that American naval aviation possessed certain vulnerabilities that Japanese pilots, even if fewer, even if less practiced than they once had been, might be able to exploit if the geometry of battle could be arranged correctly. Ozawa and his staff had studied the patterns of American operations carefully, piecing together intelligence from survivors' accounts, from signals intercepts, from the slow accumulation of knowledge that emerges in any prolonged conflict. What they believed they had discovered was this: American carrier aircraft would not travel as far as Japanese aircraft. The American planes required more fuel, consumed resources at a faster rate, operated within a shorter radius from their ships. In contrast, Japanese naval aviators had long trained for range, for the ability to strike targets that lay beyond the horizon, to inflict damage while remaining beyond the reach of American retaliation. If the Japanese fleet could position itself correctly, maintaining a distance that favored its longer-ranged aircraft while forcing the Americans into a defensive posture, then the mathematics might finally shift in Japan's favor. The mobile fleet could strike first, strike hard, and strike from a distance from which American planes could not effectively respond. In that narrow window of asymmetry, victory might still be possible. The plan itself was disarmingly simple in its framework, though elaborate in its execution. The Japanese fleet would position itself near the Marianas, a region that held critical importance in the American advance toward Japan proper. It was understood in Tokyo that the Americans would eventually come to these islands, that they would land forces there, that they would establish airfields and supply depots from which to project power ever closer to the Japanese mainland. Ozawa's strategy was to arrive before that consolidation became total, to strike at the American fleet while it was engaged in the vulnerable business of amphibious operations, when ships would be scattered, when command structures might be disrupted, when the rhythm of battle might be interrupted long enough to deliver a crushing blow. The Marianas would be not the objective itself, but rather the bait, the place where American forces would gather and where Japanese planes, arriving from a carefully calculated distance, might achieve something that had eluded Japan since the beginning of the war's Pacific phase: air superiority in a major fleet action. There was an elegance to this reasoning, a logical coherence that made sense in the quiet of a plotting room, but it depended on variables that no amount of planning could entirely control. It assumed that American commanders would behave predictably, that the distance calculations would hold true under the stress of combat, that Japanese pilots would perform at expected levels of proficiency, that the American fleet would not possess advantages that Japanese intelligence had somehow failed to detect. Most critically, it was based on a premise that had been tested and found wanting before: the belief that superior morale, superior tactical discipline, and superior understanding of naval warfare might compensate for the overwhelming material inferiority that Japan faced in the summer of 1944. Where did such confidence still come from? Perhaps from the fact that Ozawa himself had survived in command this long, that he had not been replaced, that the opportunity was being granted to him, as if it were a kind of trust placed in his judgment and his will. The admiral approached this task not as a man expecting certainty of triumph, but rather as someone who understood that certainty no longer existed anywhere in this war for Japan. Victory had become a stranger. The language of strategy had shifted toward concepts like favorable terms of engagement, or inflicting maximum damage, or defending the homeland's approaches. What Operation Ago offered was not victory in the old sense, but rather something more desperately needed, a reason to believe that the war was not entirely lost, that Japan still possessed the capacity to strike a significant blow, that the mobile fleet was not merely a remnant waiting to be extinguished, but rather an instrument of will that could still shape events. For Ozawa, and for the fleet under his command, this was the meaning of the operation. Everything that would follow, all the planning and the positioning and the launching of aircraft into a Pacific dawn, flowed from this fundamental and perhaps tragic belief that one more gamble might yet change what had seemed in recent months to be an unchangeable course. The Taiho was the newest of them, her hull still bearing the pale scars of recent construction when she joined the mobile fleet in the spring of 1944. To those who walked her decks, she felt almost untested, almost invulnerable, a ship born into an era when Japan had already begun to wonder if invulnerability was anything more than a dream. Her sister ships, the Shokaku and Zuikaku, had sailed through longer histories. They carried the weight of Pearl Harbor in their bones, the accumulated memory of victories now fading into something like mythology. And yet in that slow June, as the fleet gathered in the waters near the Philippines, all three carriers held within them the same peculiar mixture of pride and fragility, of men who had learned to live with the knowledge that tomorrow might not come. The daily rhythm aboard these ships followed patterns that had become almost ceremonial by this point in the war. Before dawn, the crew would assemble on deck for calisthenics and prayers, their voices rising in unison toward a sky that had not yet lightened, a sound that carried something of ritual and something of desperation. The younger sailors among them had grown up with these routines. They knew nothing else. But for the older men, for those who had served in peacetime and then watched the war reshape everything they knew, there was a quiet awareness that each day's repetition might be the last. The decks would be swabbed with meticulous care. The gun crews would check their weapons with a thoroughness born of long habit, rather than any real expectation that habit alone would save them. The aircraft handlers would move through their work with practiced efficiency, guiding the sleek Zeros and the slower dive bombers into position, their hands knowing the contours of the machines almost as well as they knew their own bodies. In the ready rooms, where pilots waited between flights and briefings, there existed a strange compression of time and space. Young men sat in rows on narrow benches, some reading letters from home that had arrived weeks before, others staring into an emptiness that might have been thought or might simply have been the exhaustion that never quite left anymore. How many of these men, one wonders, were consciously aware that they represented something ending? They would not have used such language. They spoke of honor, of duty, of the unbreakable will that would carry Japan to victory. And yet there must have been moments, in the quiet hours between duty calls, when the mathematics of the war became clear, in ways that no amount of rhetoric could obscure. The veteran pilots, those who had survived Midway, who had flown at Guadalcanal, who carried the scars of countless engagements, moved through this landscape with a particular kind of grace. They were thin. Many of them had developed a permanent weariness in their eyes, a quality that came not from lack of sleep alone, but from something deeper, a knowledge that could not be unlearned. These were men in their late 20s and early 30s who looked considerably older. The skill they possessed was extraordinary and terrible. They could coax an aircraft into maneuvers that should have torn it apart. They could read the air itself, understanding wind and pressure and the weight of gravity in ways that seemed almost intuitive, but there were fewer of them now than there had been before. This was perhaps the quietest tragedy of the Japanese carrier force in that spring of 1944, and it was a tragedy that played out not in a single dramatic moment, but across thousands of small absences. Japan had never developed a rotation system that would have allowed experienced pilots to return home, to train the next generation, to pass on their knowledge in a living way. A pilot who was shot down and rescued might return to flight status, but if he was not recovered, the knowledge died with him. And so with each engagement, with each loss, Japan was not merely losing aircraft and fuel, it was losing the accumulated skill of men who had learned through hard experience. The training pipeline that might have replenished this lost knowledge was itself depleted, starved of resources and fuel by the logistics of a war that stretched across an entire ocean. Young pilots were being rushed into combat with perhaps a tenth of the flight hours that their American counterparts received. The disparity was not yet obvious in the individual statistics, but it lived in the exhaustion of the men who had to fly alongside these younger recruits, who understood what their reduced training meant when the moment of combat came. There was an almost poignant contrast, then, between the physical beauty of these carriers and the depletion of the human resources within them. The Taiho's hull was strong. The Shokaku had proven herself resilient through earlier battles. The Zuikaku had earned a reputation for both seaworthiness and luck. Their air groups were carefully assembled, distributed among the 3 ships and the light carriers and battleship formations that surrounded them. And the men who crewed them, the mechanics, the deck handlers, the ammunition loaders, the cooks, the medical orderlies, the young officers who had trained for years to command in moments of crisis, they performed their duties with a dedication that was in no way diminished by the circumstances they found themselves in. Yet the simple truth was this: they were being asked to compensate with spirit and determination for capabilities that had been systematically eroded by 2.5 years of continuous warfare. The routines of the ship continued, though, because routine was what held the structure together. In the engineering spaces deep below the flight deck, men worked in heat that became almost unbearable in the tropical waters they now occupied. They tended to the massive engines that drove these ships forward, monitoring pressures and temperatures and fuel consumption with the kind of concentrated attention that mechanical systems demanded. They could not think about what the future held. The machine demanded their complete presence, and in some way, that was a mercy. Above them, on the flight decks and in the hangar bays, the aircraft were being maintained, armed, and prepared. The Zeros with their machine guns and their surprising lack of armor, the Val dive bombers with their fixed landing gear and their vulnerability to any attack from above or behind, the Jill torpedo bombers, each aircraft type represented a particular gamble, a different calculation of what mattered most in air combat. And because the Japanese naval aviation philosophy had always prioritized range and maneuverability over durability and pilot protection, every one of these machines reflected a set of assumptions about how naval air warfare should be fought that was increasingly at odds with how it actually was being fought. The men knew this on some level, though they did not speak of it directly. They prepared their aircraft, they checked their weapons, they settled into their berths at night in the spaces assigned to them, lying in darkness and listening to the ambient sounds of the ship around them, the creaks and groans of a vessel moving through water, the muffled conversations of other men awake in nearby compartments, the distant throb of the engines that never stopped. And they rose in the morning to do it all again. This was what the mobile fleet had become by June 1944. Not a force confident in its superiority, but a force committed to the appearance of readiness, to the preservation of discipline, to the belief that when the moment came, something transcendent might yet occur. The carriers themselves were merely vessels after all. What mattered was what moved through them, what guided their actions and shaped their choices, and that could not be touched by torpedoes or bombs or the relentless passage of time. And yet, beneath the careful planning and the deliberate positioning of Ozawa's fleet, there existed a truth that no amount of strategic brilliance could fully obscure, a gap, widening with each passing month, between what Japan possessed and what America had marshaled across the Pacific. It was not merely a matter of ships or tonnage, though the mathematics of that alone were grim. It was something more subtle, more corrosive. It was the attrition of human skill, the slow erosion of the irreplaceable resource that no shipyard could manufacture or replace once squandered in the furnace of war. The Japanese Navy, in the spring of 1944, found itself in a paradox that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. There were still carriers, magnificent vessels with proven records, with crews who knew their routines by heart. Yet the men who flew from those carriers, the aviators upon whom everything ultimately depended, had become a diminishing commodity. Where once the Imperial Navy had possessed a corps of veteran pilots trained in peacetime and refined through years of actual combat, there now remained only fragments of that force. The skilled men, the ones who had taken off from these same decks over Pearl Harbor, who had dueled American wildcats over the Coral Sea, who had learned through blood and fire how to survive in the thin air above warships. Many of them had not come home. The losses had been merciless and relentless. Japan, unlike America, had made a strategic choice in the early years of the Pacific War, a choice that seemed prudent at the time, but would eventually hollow out its very heart. Pilots who survived combat, who accumulated experience and knowledge, were not routinely rotated home to train the next generation. The logic was that they were too valuable where they were, too essential to the immediate fighting, and so they flew again and again, accumulating hours and kills and narrow escapes, until finally, one afternoon over some reef or lagoon, they did not come back. Their expertise died with them. It was dispersed into the Pacific like ash, and there was no mechanism in place to capture it, to pass it forward to younger men who might have learned from it. By the time Ozawa's fleet prepared for Operation Ago, this deficit had become nearly catastrophic. The American Navy, by contrast, operated under a different philosophy, one born partly from abundance, partly from hard experience. American pilots who had proven themselves in combat were pulled from the line, sent home to share what they knew. They became instructors. They trained new waves of young men in gunnery, in tactics, in the hard-won lessons that came from facing Japanese aircraft and surviving. It was a self-reinforcing cycle of knowledge and renewal, and it left Japan in a position of deepening disadvantage. What did this mean in practical terms? Consider the skill level of the men who would fly from Ozawa's carriers. Some were experienced, certainly, but their number was small. Many were young, relatively recent graduates of flight training programs that had themselves declined in quality as the war dragged on. There was less fuel available for extensive practice flights. Training cycles had been compressed. There was a desperation to get pilots operational as quickly as possible, which meant less time spent on the fundamentals, less exposure to the kinds of scenarios they might actually encounter in battle, and those scenarios, when they came, would be unforgiving. The radar situation presented a parallel limitation, though one less visible to the men whose lives depended on it. The Japanese Navy had developed radar technology, but it lagged significantly behind what the Americans had deployed across their fleet by 1944. American radar had become sophisticated, reliable, widely distributed. It allowed their ships to detect incoming aircraft at ranges that seemed almost supernatural to the Japanese. It allowed their fighter directors, men sitting in darkened rooms aboard ships, speaking calmly into headsets, to guide American Hellcats onto Japanese formations before the Japanese pilots had any awareness they had been detected. It was a kind of vision in the darkness, and Japan simply did not possess it in equal measure. Moreover, the Americans had a system, an integrated system of radar, radio communication, fighter direction, and coordinated response that functioned almost as a single organism. When American radar detected a Japanese strike coming in, that information flowed instantly to the men who needed it. Fighters were vectored to intercept. Calculations were made. American aircraft arrived at the point of engagement with the sun behind them, with altitude advantage, with numbers, meeting the Japanese exactly where and when American commanders had chosen. The Japanese, by contrast, operated in relative blindness. They had to search the horizon. They had to rely on spotters and luck. By the time they knew American fighters were coming, those fighters were often already upon them. And then there was the shadow that lay across everything, the vast, almost incomprehensible industrial capacity of the United States. It was not merely that America had more ships, it was that America could afford to lose ships and replace them. It was that America produced aircraft in such numbers that attrition, which would have been catastrophic for Japan, was merely an accounting problem for America. The aircraft industry of the United States was a kind of unstoppable machine, turning out Hellcats and Corsairs in production runs that dwarfed anything Japan could manage. If a Hellcat was shot down, another came off the assembly line. If an American pilot was killed, there was another trained pilot waiting to fly. If an aircraft carrier was damaged, there were more slips in American shipyards, more hulls under construction, more platforms waiting to be commissioned. Japan, by contrast, operated under the logic of scarcity. Every aircraft that was lost meant one fewer aircraft. Every pilot killed was a pilot who took irreplaceable knowledge with him into death. Every carrier damaged became a carrier that sat in dry dock, while Japan struggled to manufacture the resources for repair. It was a mathematics of subtraction, carried out month after month, year after year, until the sum began to approach zero. Ozawa understood this. The strategic calculations that lay behind Operation Eigo were premised, partly, on the hope that a decisive blow struck at the right moment might change the calculus, that if Japan could inflict sufficient damage on American carrier strength in a single concentrated action, perhaps the American appetite for continuing the war might falter. It was a gamble, certainly, but what choice remained? The imbalance was not something that suddenly appeared in June of 1944. It had been accumulating, layer upon layer, decision upon decision, loss upon loss, for nearly 3 years. By the spring of that year, it had become the fundamental condition of Japanese naval warfare. The fleet that Ozawa commanded was not the same fleet that had swept across the Pacific in 1941 and 1942. It was a fleet that had been diminished, depleted, and forced to compensate for its losses with hope and determination and a kind of quiet desperation that no amount of spiritual fervor could entirely disguise. And yet the men involved in this moment, the aviators, the sailors, the commanders who saw this imbalance clearly, none of them could simply walk away. History had not presented them with alternatives. They could only move forward into what was coming, carrying with them the understanding that they were fighting not merely against the American Navy, but against the entire machinery of American industrial civilization. In that moment, on the threshold of battle, that knowledge rested upon the fleet, like the weight of the entire Pacific Ocean, pressing down from above. On the morning of June 15, 1944, American landing craft touched down on the western beaches of Saipan, and in the war rooms and ship's bridges of the Japanese combined fleet, men who had waited months for their opportunity finally understood that the moment had arrived. Not with urgency, but with a peculiar sense of inevitability, the way a drawn thread finally begins to unravel when someone pulls it taut. The American assault was not a surprise. Japanese intelligence had warned of the vulnerability of Saipan for some time. The Mariana Islands sat like jewels in the strategic necklace of Japan's defensive perimeter, and Saipan especially held importance as both a military stronghold and a civilian refuge, home to thousands of Japanese civilians whose lives were now about to be drawn into the grinding machinery of warfare. Admiral Ozawa had been waiting for precisely this moment. His mobile fleet, gathered now in Philippine waters, had been conceived for this very purpose, not to defend Saipan directly, which would have been the work of garrison forces and land-based air wings, but to strike at the American fleet that came to support the landings. The logic was elegant in its brutal simplicity. Bring the American carriers into battle on a field where Japanese aircraft could strike first, where superior range might compensate for inferior numbers, where God and the spirit of Yamato might yet tip the scales. Saipan was the bait, the American fleet was the quarry, and Ozawa's carriers, waiting somewhere in Philippine waters, were the trap spring. Consider what had driven the Japanese Navy to this moment. For 2 years, since the disaster at Midway, the carrier force had been bleeding. Not all at once, but steadily. like a man with a deep wound who grows paler with each passing day. Every island campaign had cost them pilots, experienced men who could not simply be replaced by boys fresh from flight school. The pilots of 1942 had been hardened by battle over the Dutch East Indies, refined in fire above Wake Island and Pearl Harbor itself. They knew how to read the sky, how to work with their wingmen, how to sense danger in the throttle response of their engines. By 1944, many of those men were gone, either resting in shallow graves across the Pacific or rotated home to train the next generation, leaving behind only memory and absence. The replacement pilots were younger, less seasoned, and they had not yet learned the thousand subtle lessons that separated the survivors from the casualties. Japan had no system of pilot rotation that would have allowed experienced men to go home and teach others. The Americans, it would be learned much later, had such a system. It was one of the small, invisible differences that would ultimately matter more than armor plate or engine horsepower. The Philippines remained the true anchor of Japanese strategy, and Saipan, though important, was ultimately expendable in the larger calculus. But the principle was not. If the American fleet could be brought to battle while supporting Saipan, and if that American fleet could be damaged sufficiently, then perhaps the broader American advance across the Pacific might be delayed. Perhaps reinforcements and replacements might be stretched thin. Perhaps the people at home, if American casualties mounted high enough, might begin to question whether the war was truly worth the blood being spilled on atolls with names no one could pronounce. This was the dream that Ozawa carried into the Philippine Sea. The orders came down through the chain of command. Prepare for sortie. The fleet would depart, would sail eastward toward the Marianas, would hunt for the American carriers, and would offer battle on terms of Japan's own choosing. There was something almost meditative about the way the decision was made, not the frantic scramble of men facing sudden crisis, but rather the careful turning of a ship that has always been pointed in a certain direction. The machinery had been wound for months. Now, finally, someone had wound it tight enough to release. The passage from Philippine waters toward Saipan took several days. Submarines reported American positions. Reconnaissance aircraft sent back information, fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, about the disposition of enemy forces. Weather reports were studied. Charts were marked. Officers gathered in dimly lit compartments deep in the bowels of flagship and cruiser alike, tracing lines on maps with pencils, speaking in low voices about angles of approach and timing, and the mysterious calculus by which battles were won or lost. What was said in those rooms was never fully recorded, but we can imagine the tenor, not confident exactly, but determined. A sense that the moment was upon them now, that hesitation would only weaken what advantages they possessed, that waiting any longer would allow the Americans to entrench themselves further on Saipan and extend their supply lines into what had once been unchallenged Japanese territory. The young officers and sailors who crewed the ships of the mobile fleet understood, at some level, that they were sailing toward something momentous. Not all of them could articulate it. Some felt it only as a tightness in the chest, a quickening of the pulse, a particular quality to the light on the water that seemed to carry warning. Others spoke of it to their friends in hushed conversations below decks, sharing fears and hopes in the way young men do when facing the unknown. The veterans among them, and there were still some, said nothing much at all. They had seen enough to know that what would happen in the coming days was beyond influence now. All that was left was to do their duty and trust that training and preparation, and perhaps some element of fate or divine will, would see them through. And so the fleet sailed eastward, through waters that had belonged to Japan since the Great War, waters that were supposed to be sanctuary and fortress, drawn inexorably towards Saipan, as if by gravity itself. The American landing craft were already ashore. American engineers and support troops were already beginning the work of establishing supply lines. American command posts were already being set up in the sand. The machines of invasion, once set in motion, could rarely be stopped, but they might be made to pay a price. They might be slowed, they might be turned back. That was the hope that carried the mobile fleet eastward into June. The closer the Japanese ships drew to the battle zone, the more the ordinary rhythms of ship's life were disrupted. Ammunition was checked and rechecked. Aircraft were inspected and re-inspected. Crews were stood to brief combat readiness, then stood down, then brought back to readiness again. The uncertainty of not yet knowing when battle would commence created a strange temporal tension, a sense of time both crawling and racing simultaneously. Hours felt like days. The nights seemed to stretch for eternities. And yet somehow the appointed moment drew nearer with each passing watch, as if all the waiting, all the preparation, all the hope and dread that had accumulated was pulling the two fleets together with the inexorability of celestial mechanics, pulling them toward collision over a remote cluster of Pacific islands where men would soon rise into the dawn sky and fly toward their deaths. In the days that led toward June the 19th, the men aboard Ozawa's carriers fell into rhythms that were at once entirely ordinary and suffused with an awareness that ordinary time might be running out. The ships themselves seemed to absorb this quiet tension, the constant low pulse of the engines, the creak of steel in the tropical heat, the distant calls of sailors moving through corridors whose every turn had become as familiar as memory itself. On the Taiho, the great new flagship whose speed and modernity had filled her crew with a fragile pride, men began writing letters home, in cramped quarters below decks, in corners of the gun galleries where the breeze moved through the superstructure. They sat with pencil and paper, searching for words that might mean something to someone far away in Japan. What does one write when the future is genuinely unknowable? Some men filled pages with practical instructions, where money was hidden, which relatives should be contacted, small inheritances of routine domesticity. Others found themselves writing almost nothing at all, staring at blank paper as if words themselves had become too heavy to lift. Many wrote only a single sentence, sometimes only a name, as if brevity might be a kind of honesty. The letters were collected carefully, sealed, and stored below with a tacit understanding that they might be all that remained of certain men by the time the mail found its way back to the home islands. The rituals of faith deepened in those waiting days. Shinto shrines existed in small spaces aboard nearly every ship, modest alcoves with offerings of rice or sake, tokens of spiritual attention in the midst of a floating fortress of steel and machinery. Men would pause there, sometimes alone, sometimes in quiet groups, to perform the small gestures that had sustained Japanese spiritual life for centuries. They would bow, clap their hands twice, as if to call the attention of something vast and patient, and stand in silence. A few would whisper prayers, though the prayers themselves were often simple, almost mundane requests for safe passage, for steady hands, for the courage to meet whatever came. Were these prayers offering comfort, or were they perhaps a way of establishing a kind of conversation with uncertainty itself? It is difficult, at this distance, to know what faith meant to a man standing on the deck of a carrier in 1944, waiting for battle. But it mattered to them, and the repetition of these small spiritual acts, the bowing, the offerings, the whispered words, formed a kind of thread that connected each man to generations of ancestors, to a continuity that battle seemed poised to sever. The younger pilots, many of them barely past their 20th year, gathered in small groups in the ready rooms and crew quarters, their conversations drifting between the mundane and the profound, with the ease of men accustomed to living between those poles. They spoke of their families, their hometowns, the texture of ordinary life that seemed both infinitely distant and achingly real. Some had girlfriends they barely knew, relationships begun in wartime haste. Others spoke of mothers, of siblings they had left years ago when they volunteered for the Navy. The conversations were punctuated by long silences, by the peculiar camaraderie of young men facing the same unknown future together. They checked their aircraft with almost ritualistic care, running hands along fuselages, testing controls, whispering to the machines, as if familiarity itself might be a kind of protection. A pilot would know every flaw in his particular plane, every quirk of its handling, the precise moment at which it wanted to climb, or the way wind moved across its wings. In some ways, these young men knew their aircraft the way medieval knights knew their horses, and that knowledge was deeply, almost spiritually intimate. Food took on a ceremonial quality in those final days before battle. Officers arranged for extra rations, small luxuries that had become rare as the war deepened and Japan's supply lines grew ever more tenuous. Fresh fish appeared, and vegetables, items that had become scarce enough to feel almost like indulgence. The crew ate together, and these meals became occasions of sorts, moments where the simple act of sharing food seemed to acknowledge something larger than hunger. Some men ate with evident appetite, savoring the taste and texture as if committing them to memory. Others picked at their food, their stomachs tight with anticipation, unable to do more than move the meal around their plates. The cooks understood, perhaps better than anyone, that they were feeding not just bodies but spirits, and they poured care and attention into meals that might be among the last these men would eat. Small personal rituals accumulated across the fleet. Men polished their uniforms with extra care, pressed their white navy shorts with meticulous attention, arranged their belongings with a precision that seemed to suggest that order in the small world of a cabin might somehow extend into the larger chaos of battle. Some carried photographs, a wife, parents, a child born while he was away at sea and known only through letters and now faded pictures. Others kept talismans, small charms that had traveled with them across years of war, objects imbued with significance that existed only in the mind of the man who carried them. A smooth stone, a lock of hair, a handkerchief embroidered by a sister. These objects were touched, examined, held close in moments when the mind drifted toward what was coming. Were they superstitions, these small rituals? Perhaps. But they were also deeply human responses to uncertainty, ways that men assert order and meaning in the face of forces far larger than themselves. The senior officers, meanwhile, carried their own anxieties in different forms. They reviewed plans repeatedly, examined intelligence reports that showed the American forces gathering in the Marianas, carriers, battleships, an overwhelming aggregation of material power. Admiral Ozawa himself maintained an outward composure that was almost sculptural in its perfection, yet those closest to him noticed the tightness around his eyes, the precise, controlled way he moved through the spaces of command. He believed deeply in the righteousness of Operation Ago, in the possibility that superior tactics and the spiritual resolve of the Japanese sailor might overcome the mechanical abundance the Americans seemed to possess without limit. But belief and hope are not the same thing, and perhaps somewhere in the spaces between those two states lived the knowledge that what was about to unfold would test both in ways that could not be predicted or controlled. In the evenings, as the sun fell across the Pacific and the air temperature dropped towards something almost comfortable, men climbed to the rails of their ships and stood looking out at the sea. The water was dark, almost black in the dimming light, and it seemed to contain within itself all the possibilities of what was coming. Some men stood alone, others gathered in small groups, their conversations falling away into silence. Perhaps they were praying without words. Perhaps they were simply saying goodbye, wordlessly, to a life that each man knew might end within hours. The ships moved through the darkness, riding the swell, carrying their freight of human hope and human dread toward a meeting that would test everything they were, everything they had been taught to believe about honor and sacrifice, and the capacity of the human will to overcome material disadvantage. None of them knew then how the battle would unfold, or what they would lose, or what meaning history would eventually assign to their courage and their suffering. They only knew that they were moving toward something, that the fleet was drawing closer to the American forces with each passing hour, and that in the days immediately ahead, many of them would face questions about existence and duty that had no certain answers. The waiting itself became a kind of meditation, a space where past and future seemed to collapse into a peculiar present moment, and where the ordinary acts of writing letters, saying prayers, tending to machines, and standing at the rail in the gathering darkness took on a weight and significance that exceeded their surface meaning. There existed, woven through the spiritual fabric of the Japanese Navy in that spring of 1944, a concept as deeply held as any piece of steel or ammunition in the arsenal. It was called Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Yamato, the ancient name for Japan itself. And in the minds of officers and sailors alike, this spirit was understood not as mere sentiment or patriotic fervor, but as something close to a compensatory force, a counterweight, something that might, in theory, balance an equation that material reality had begun to tip irreversibly against them. To understand how thoroughly this idea had taken root is to glimpse the profound psychological strain of the moment. Japan's industrial capacity, measured against America's vast productive machinery, had become almost laughably unequal by 1944. The Americans were building ships, planes, and training pilots at rates that seemed to violate the laws of human effort. Yet the Japanese Navy, proud, disciplined, steeped in centuries of warrior tradition, could not quite accept that industrial disparity alone might determine the outcome. There had to be something more. There had to be something that superiority of the spirit could accomplish. Yamato Damashi was that something. It was not invented in 1944. The concept stretched back through Japanese military culture for generations, rooted in Bushido, the way of the warrior, and in the samurai traditions that still echoed through the officer corps. But in this moment, with fleets growing fewer and pilots growing less experienced, it took on a particular urgency. If materiality could be overcome by moral superiority, by unshakable resolve, by a willingness to sacrifice beyond what any reasonable calculation would demand, then perhaps the equation might still balance. The belief was sincere. It was not cynicism imposed from above, though certainly military propaganda amplified and weaponized it. Officers genuinely believed it. Young sailors, writing letters they suspected might be their last, often invoked it. There was an almost liturgical quality to how the phrase appeared in naval communications, in officers' orders, in the personal testimonies that survive from those final days. Yamato Damashi would carry them through. It would inspire the pilots to find targets the Americans thought unreachable. It would steel the nerves of anti-aircraft crews to hold their fire until the last possible moment. It would transform defeat into a kind of spiritual victory, even if the ships sank. How do we hold this belief in our modern understanding? It is worth pausing here, in the darkness and quiet, to consider the question honestly. We might be tempted to dismiss it as mere delusion, as a tragedy of the human capacity for self-deception. But to do so would be to flatten something more complex. Yamato Damashi was, in part, a genuine cultural philosophy, one with real historical roots and real meaning within its own context. It was also, undeniably, a mechanism by which a military hierarchy could ask young men to accept almost certain death while preserving the illusion that their sacrifice served a transcendent purpose. The naval command structure, from Ozawa downward, did not simply believe in Yamato Damashi as a substitute for aircraft or fuel or trained pilots. Rather, it was conceived as a multiplier, a force that could extend what limited resources they possessed. If you could not match the Americans plane for plane, or ship for ship, then perhaps you could match them in audacity, in tactical surprise, in the sheer force of collective will. The longer range of Japanese aircraft, the element of surprise offered by Operation Ago itself, the possibility of striking first and withdrawing before American counterstrikes could reach their full weight. These were not fantasies. They were rational tactical considerations. But threading through all of them was the assumption that Yamato Damashi, that peculiar Japanese spirit, could make the difference, could elevate strategy into something that transcended material reality. There is something almost poignant in examining this now, centuries later, knowing what would follow. Not poignant in a sentimental way, but in the way that a carefully constructed argument becomes poignant when you know the premise upon which it rests will be proven false. The sailors and officers of the Mobile Fleet in June 1944 were not fools. They understood that they were outnumbered, outgunned, and increasingly short on trained pilots. But they also understood something else. that they might be the last Japanese fleet capable of mounting an offensive operation of any scale, that if they did not fight now, the war would come to them, to the home islands. That Yamato Damashi, whatever its limitations as a substitute for industrial capacity, was perhaps the only weapon they still possessed in abundance. And so it became woven into the fabric of daily life aboard those carriers. The rituals intensified. Prayers at dawn became more fervent. The letters home carried not just personal affection, but invocations of duty and honor. The pilots who gathered in briefing rooms, many of them acutely aware that they were less experienced than pilots they might face, steeled themselves with the concept. If their training was incomplete, their aircraft slightly older, their numbers fewer, still they had Yamato Damashi. They had the spirit of warriors facing an impossible challenge with dignity and resolve. It is important to note, with a soft touch, that this was not unique to Japan. Every military culture possesses mechanisms by which to reconcile the gap between what is and what is hoped for. The concept simply crystallized differently here, in a philosophical language with deeper historical resonance. For these men, Yamato Damashi was not propaganda in the sense of something false, imposed from without. It was a lens through which the true was filtered, reframed, made bearable. The night before battle, and we approach that dawn now, moving forward through the hours. Men sat on the darkened decks of carriers, or in the confined spaces of crew quarters, or in ready rooms where aircraft waited. Some read letters from home, some wrote their own, some sat in silence, meditating on what the next day might bring. And somewhere in that quiet, in the gentle creak of the ship and the soft rush of the Pacific night, Yamato Damashi was present, not as a substitute for fear, but as a companion to it, as a way of transforming fear into purpose, as a language in which to speak about death and duty in the same breath. The concept carried an implicit contract, that if you gave everything, if you embraced the sacrifice completely, then something transcendent would occur. Your death would become immortal, your name would be remembered, the spirit itself would endure, even if your body, your ship, your nation did not. It was a contract, written in poetry and blood, signed by men who understood they might never see home again. Within the planning rooms aboard the Japanese fleet carriers, there existed a single assumption that seemed almost certain on paper, almost ironclad in the calculations that officers had refined through countless hours of strategic reasoning. The Japanese aircraft, it was believed, could strike the enemy from distances that lay far beyond the reach of American planes in return. This asymmetry of range, this mathematical advantage inscribed in the very specifications of their aircraft, represented perhaps the only decisive edge that Ozawa possessed as he brought his fleet into position north of the Philippine Sea. It was the foundation upon which Operation Ago rested, the secret mathematics that allowed a commander to imagine victory even when his radar was poorer, his pilots greener, and his carriers fewer in number. The Mitsubishi Zero, that elegant and fearsome fighter that had dominated the early war, could indeed fly farther than most American counterparts. The range of Japanese carrier bombers and reconnaissance aircraft extended well beyond what the Grumman F-6F Hellcat or the Douglas SBD Dauntless could achieve. If Ozawa could launch his strike first, if he could deliver his blow from a distance where American aircraft could not yet respond, then perhaps the calculus of attrition could be shifted. Perhaps the Japanese fleet could inflict such damage on the American carriers that the balance would tip, just enough, just long enough, for victory to become possible. There was a logic to this thinking, and it was not entirely illusory. The concept hinged on what was called in Japanese naval doctrine a distant engagement, a fleet action fought across the horizon, where visual contact was minimal and radar became the sense through which both sides perceived one another. Admiral Ozawa had positioned his mobile fleet with this advantage in mind. His 3 carrier divisions were arranged in a formation that would allow him to launch wave after wave of aircraft while his enemy remained beyond their reach. The Taiho, the Shokaku, and the Zuikaku would unleash their complement of fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes. These machines would fly outward into the Pacific dawn, across the blue void, and strike at the American task forces before those American planes could turn and fly back to retaliate. This assumption, comfortable and mathematical, would shape every decision that Ozawa made in the hours and days immediately before contact was established. It was not mere wishful thinking, though wishful thinking was certainly present in the high councils of the Japanese Navy. It was instead a doctrine forged through experience and refined through technical study. Japanese planners had examined the specifications of their aircraft and the specifications of American aircraft, and they had drawn conclusions that seemed to support this vision of a first strike delivered with impunity. Yet within this assumption lay several fractures that had not been adequately perceived, or perhaps had been perceived but not accepted. The American F-6F Hellcat, though it could not match the Zero's range in the abstract, had been equipped by the middle of 1944 with external drop tanks that could be jettisoned once the pilot approached the target area. The Grumman fighter could thus achieve a radius of action that approached, and in some configurations exceeded, that of the Japanese machines. Furthermore, and perhaps more critically, American pilots were trained to use their radar effectively, to vector aircraft onto distant targets with a precision that still felt novel and almost magical to the Japanese. American carrier doctrine had evolved to embrace coordinated attacks guided by electronics rather than visual spotting. But more fundamentally, and this was the deepest miscalculation of all, Ozawa did not fully grasp the sheer density of American air power. The Essex-class carriers that formed the core of Task Force 58 possessed aircraft complements that had been expanded and rationalized through the previous year of war. When the Japanese admiral looked at the numbers, he saw an American fleet with more carriers, yes, but he did not fully internalize what that meant in terms of the avalanche of aircraft that could be launched simultaneously. The idea that an American carrier task force could put hundreds of planes into the air in a single coordinated effort and then recover them, refuel them, rearm them, and launch them again within the space of a few hours was a concept that existed in the realm of theory for Japanese officers but had not been emotionally or strategically absorbed. Ozawa's plan was to strike first, to strike hard, and to strike from beyond immediate retaliation. The mechanics of this were sound. The Japanese fleet air arm would launch in successive waves, perhaps beginning in the early morning, when visibility was favorable, and the distance to the American fleet was still maximal. The first wave would encounter the American Combat Air Patrol, those defending fighters that every carrier maintained in the sky around the clock. In theory, the defenders would be overwhelmed by numbers, or at least by the coordinated approach of multiple striking groups. Losses would be severe, but not prohibitive. The bombers and torpedo planes would penetrate to the American carriers and deliver their ordnance. Fires would bloom across the American flight decks. The rate at which American planes could be launched and recovered would be reduced. The balance of attrition, over the course of hours or perhaps days, would begin to shift in Japan's favor. It was an elegant theory, and it was a theory that would be tested against reality in a way that would shatter it utterly. But in the days immediately before the fleets converged, in the darkness and stillness of the Philippine Sea, north of the Mariana Islands, the theory held sway. Officers on the Japanese carriers believed in the range advantage. They believed that the first strike would determine the battle. They believed that if they could launch their aircraft before the American pilots even knew that enemy planes were coming, then the advantage would be theirs. There was a kind of comfort in this belief, a structure that could support the hopes and fears of men who were about to risk everything. The approaching American fleet, even now, was moving westward under cover of carrier aircraft combat patrols and under the watchful eyes of submarines that had been positioned along the likely approaches. The American commanders, operating with superior radar and superior intelligence, already possessed a far clearer picture of where the Japanese fleet was located and where it was moving. Spruance and Mitcher, the American admirals commanding Task Force 58, were preparing not for a distant engagement, but for a battle fought over relatively close ranges, where American industrial capacity and American pilot training would be decisive. But Ozawa did not yet know this. Ozawa knew only that his fleet was moving into position, that his aircraft were being armed and fueled, that the first light of dawn would bring the moment when history would be written across the sky. The night had begun to thin. It was still before dawn on June 19, 1944, but there was already a pale reluctance in the eastern sky, as though the darkness itself was slowly loosening its grip. Aboard the carriers of the mobile fleet, men who had not slept moved through their stations with the deliberate motions of those performing rituals they had performed 1,000 times before. There was no alarm, no urgent bell, just the quiet unfurling of routine, the steady murmur of voices that seemed almost to apologize for their own existence. The flight decks began to brighten, not yet with sunlight, but with the glow of work lights strung along the superstructure. Mechanics moved between the aircraft like silent custodians in a temple, checking each lock, each bolt, each fuel line, with the care of men who understood that their precision might mean the difference between return and obliteration. The Zeros sat in their orderly rows, their wings folded or extended depending on their readiness, their fuselages catching the electric light in ways that made them look somehow both fragile and terrible. Every pilot who saw them felt the weight of what they carried. In the ready rooms, the aviators waited. They had been briefed in the hours before, given their vectors, their altitudes, their objectives. The Americans were out there. That was certain. How far, in what disposition, with what strength, these remained the province of educated guesswork. The officers who conducted the briefings spoke with the quiet authority of men who had thought through contingency, though contingency had a way of surprising even the most thorough planners. The pilots listened and did not ask many questions. They had learned that asking questions sometimes revealed uncertainties it was better to face than to acknowledge aloud. There was a quality to the air in those minutes that those who survived them never quite forgot. Salt, oil, the metal and kerosene smell of aviation fuel. Underneath it all, something else. Perhaps merely the anxiety of their own bodies, the sweat that accumulated in anticipation, the particular smell of men about to do a thing from which some of them would not return. No one spoke of it directly, but it was there, a presence as real as the decking beneath their feet. As the horizon began its true transformation from black to indigo to pale grey, the order to man aircraft was given, not with a shout, with a hand signal. With a quiet word passed from officer to officer, the pilots rose, gathered their flight maps and their writing instruments, and moved toward the ladder that would take them to their planes. Some made small gestures, a touch to a shrine, a glance toward a photograph carried in a pocket. These were men trained in military discipline, and yet they were also men who understood, in a way that discipline sometimes permits, that they were about to enter a realm where discipline ceased to matter much at all. The engines began to turn over. This was the moment when everything became immediate. The sound started as a distant cough, then a rumble, then a roar that seemed to contain within it both power and vulnerability. Each engine turning over was a small miracle of combustion, each one a gamble that it would continue to run at the moment when running mattered most. The pilots sat in their cockpits, narrow, cramped spaces where they were bound to their aircraft almost as intimately as a man is bound to his own body, and they waited for the signal to advance toward the flight deck. Dawn had now arrived, though the sun itself had not yet broken the horizon. The light was that peculiar grey gold that precedes sunrise, when the entire sky seems to be glowing from within, as though the world itself were being illuminated from some source just beyond perception. This was the preferred time for launching. The light was good enough for the pilots to navigate, and yet it had not reached the full brightness that made them visible to American radar operators stationed on distant ships, or at least that was the calculation. Whether it proved accurate would be a matter for later measurement. The aircraft began to move. The first wave was assembled now, perhaps 70 or 80 planes in total, Zeros for combat air patrol, the swift Judos intended to serve as dive bombers, the larger Vals that carried the heavier bombs and flew with less speed but greater payload. They rolled forward along the flight deck in sequence, each one aligned with the catapult or the launching line, depending on the carrier and the procedure. The moment of tension was always just before, in that instant when the pilot waited for the signal, when all the variables of preparation suddenly crystallized into a single question: would the aircraft lift? Would it maintain altitude? Would it respond to the controls with the precision that flight demanded? The signals were given. One after another, the aircraft were launched. Some rolled along the flight deck and lifted with the serene inevitability of things meant to fly. Others required assistance, their wheels catching on the catapult mechanisms that yanked them forward, compressing their landing gear, and then releasing them into the air, with a violence that was barely contained. The sound was extraordinary, a combination of engine roar and mechanical complaint, and the thin scream of metal under stress. To those watching from below decks, it was almost as though the ship itself was in pain. And yet the pilots, in the moment of launching, heard something different. They heard the particular tenor of their own engine, the subtle variations in RPM that told them whether they were receiving full power or operating at diminished capacity. They felt the acceleration through their bodies, through the seat that held them, through the control stick that they held in their hands. They watched the nose of their aircraft rise slightly as the airspeed increased and the wings began to generate lift. And then, the moment of transition, the aircraft was no longer rolling along a surface. It was aloft. It was flying. The first wave rose from the carriers in the gradually brightening dawn. They formed their formations slowly, circling above the fleet, gaining altitude, organizing themselves into the tactical arrangements that experience had taught them were most effective. The roar of the engines was tremendous, but to the pilots themselves, inside their individual aircraft, it became something almost ordinary, a constant that the mind learned to ignore in much the same way that a person learns to ignore the sound of their own breathing. Below them, the carrier force became a geometric pattern. The flat decks, the angled silhouettes of the cruisers and battleships, the small dots that were destroyers arrayed in their protective screens. The ocean beneath them was dark blue in the pre-dawn light, unmarked by any visible enemy. The Americans were out there somewhere, perhaps 100 miles to the east, perhaps more. The vectors provided in the briefings would guide them toward the reported position. Whether the Americans would still be there when they arrived, or whether they would have moved, or whether the entire report was an error born of misread radar or the overactive imagination of an observer on a distant island, these things could not be known until they had flown for enough time to discover the answer. The formations completed themselves. Wave after wave rose from the carriers, each consisting of a different composition of aircraft, depending on the tactical role, the carrier's capabilities, the experience of the pilots involved. The sunrise was now beginning in earnest. The sun itself broke the horizon in that gradual way that sunrises have, not suddenly, but with a kind of inevitability, as though it had always been rising and the world had simply been waiting to notice it. The sky shifted from grey to gold to pale blue, and the first wave of Japanese carrier aircraft, carrying in their wings and fuselages the hopes and the desperations of a nation that believed it might yet salvage something from the wreckage of its ambitions, turned eastward and disappeared into the distance. While the morning sky above the Philippine Sea grew thick with aircraft and the sound of engines multiplied into something almost like thunder, a different kind of silence occupied the water 200 feet below. In the depths, where light becomes a memory and pressure transforms steel into something almost organic, two American submarines moved with the patience of creatures that had learned to exist in a world where haste meant death. The USS Albacore and the USS Kavala had been stationed in the approaches to the Philippine Sea for weeks, their captains and crews waiting in the darkness, with the kind of attention that only comes from knowing that one moment of perfect timing might change the course of an entire war. They were hunter submarines, built and trained to move unseen, and on this particular morning they had stumbled into what might be described as the greatest opportunity of their operational lives. The Taiho, That immense new carrier with her gleaming armor belt and her promise of modern engineering had become the target of Commander Eugene Fluckey aboard the Albacore. She was the flagship, the pride, the symbol of Japan's renewed naval strength, and she had emerged into waters that belonged, in every practical sense, to American submarines. The approach itself required a kind of balletic precision. To close the distance on a battleship or a carrier meant moving against the grain of nature, fighting current and thermocline boundaries, managing the delicate equilibrium between speed and stealth. Fluckey had positioned his boat with the kind of patience that defines submariners, understanding that at any moment, a Japanese escort destroyer or a diving aircraft could transform his vessel from predator into prey. The weight of the Taiho above, magnificent and fatal, drew him forward, not with eagerness, but with the cold recognition that this was what the Albacore had been designed to do. Consider for a moment the strange asymmetry of modern naval warfare in this era. The Japanese carrier, with all her sophistication and her 1,000-plus crew members, with her air group representing months of training and irreplaceable resources, moved through three-dimensional space with a kind of ponderous grandeur. She could not stop. She could not easily maneuver without sacrificing the careful geometry required to launch and recover her aircraft. She was, in a sense, committed to her path, and that commitment was itself a vulnerability. The submarines, by contrast, existed in a realm where invisibility was survival, where a captain could spend hours stationary, drifting, barely alive in any conventional sense, waiting for the moment when physics and fortune aligned. Fluckey had made that calculation, and the Albacore had glided into position. Somewhere nearby, another submarine had come to very similar conclusions. The USS Kavala, under the command of Commander Herman Kostler, had been making the same silent transit through waters that Ozawa's fleet had claimed as their own, but could not truly control. Submarines were the secret America had spent vast resources developing and deploying throughout the Pacific, and in these crucial waters, they represented an intelligence and a capability that Ozawa could not see and could barely defend against. The Japanese had screening destroyers, but destroyers were weapons designed for surface combat, and a submarine at depth operated in a realm where conventional naval defenses struggled to reach. Sonar existed, but it was still a tentative technology, not yet the dominant sense that it would become in later wars. What the Japanese possessed instead was what we might call tactical blindness, an inability to perceive threats that occupied three dimensions of approach rather than the two-dimensional plane where most surface combat unfolded. The Taiho steamed on, and Fluckey made his preparations. His crew, men who had trained for this moment across months and years, moved through their tasks with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that their own lives depended on precision. The torpedo tubes were being readied, range calculations were being made. The target was so immense, so impossibly visible through the periscope, that it seemed almost unfair, and yet the careful craft required to close the distance, to position the boat, to launch and to escape, was anything but simple. What might have seemed like opportunity from a distance was, at the moment of engagement, a problem of extraordinary complexity. But complexity was something that submarine crews had learned to inhabit. It was their medium, as much as the ocean itself. And what of the Shokaku? That other great carrier, the veteran of Pearl Harbor, the ship that had seen so much of the war's beginning, was also moving through these waters, also committed to the pattern of Ozawa's approaching battle. The Kavala, operating perhaps with slightly more fortune or slightly more aggressive positioning, had identified the Shokaku and was preparing to engage her as well. It is one of the peculiar facts of this moment in the war that two major fleet carriers, among the most valuable possessions of the Japanese Navy, were about to be struck not by aircraft or by surface vessels, but by weapons that approached from below, from a direction where no conventional defense was truly possible. The irony would have been transparent to any observer with the gift of prophecy, but in the present moment, with the morning's air battle only just beginning to unfold, no one among the Japanese fleet command could perceive what was about to happen. The submarines themselves were vessels of extraordinary vulnerability, despite their stealth. A submarine was, in one sense, a coffin with an engine, a tight space where men lived in conditions of physical compression and psychological intensity that tested human endurance in ways that few other environments could match. The air grew stale, the atmosphere required constant management. Equipment broke, and repairs had to be effected in spaces so confined that a man with a wrench could barely swing it. And yet inside these uncomfortable chambers of steel, American submariners had developed a culture of professionalism and a willingness to accept risk that had made them, by 1944, one of the most effective weapons systems in the Pacific War. Fluckey knew his boat, Kostler knew his. They understood the boundaries of what their vessels could do and the price of exceeding those boundaries. As the morning progressed, each captain was making calculations about how close to approach, how long to stay in position, and when the moment to strike would present itself. There is something almost meditative in the way a submarine waits. Time moves differently in the depths. Hours can pass in what feels like minutes when a man's attention is entirely consumed by the work of remaining invisible and maintaining the delicate systems that keep a submarine alive. The albacore hung in the water, perhaps, watching through her periscope as the Taiho's bulk cut through the surface far above. The Kavala was approaching the Shokaku with the same patient intensity, the same careful coordination of course and speed that would allow the moment of firing to arrive as a function of geometry rather than luck. Above them, the morning air battle was intensifying. Waves of Japanese aircraft were climbing into the sky, beginning their long approach toward the American fleet. The Japanese pilots, many of them undertrained and poorly prepared, were flying toward an enemy that they could not yet see. And below them, 2 American submarines were positioning themselves for strikes that would be far more damaging to the Japanese cause than any of those airborne pilots could possibly imagine. The ocean kept its secrets, and in that June morning, it was keeping the most important ones of all. The Taiho was the newest carrier in Ozawa's fleet, and on the morning of the 19th, she carried the flag of the operation itself, her command staff orchestrating the waves of aircraft lifting away into the warm Philippine dawn. She was among the mightiest vessels ever built for the Japanese Navy, displacing over 30,000 tons, her flight deck stretching nearly 700 feet, her hull reinforced with armor plating that her designers believed would protect her from the violence that surrounded her. Yet within hours of that first launch, the submarine albacore, threading through the Japanese destroyer screen in the hazy light, would bring a single torpedo into her starboard side, and no amount of steel or pride would save her. The impact was not catastrophic in itself. A single torpedo strike, for a ship of her size and construction, should have been survivable. The officers and crew felt the shudder of the explosion, heard the deep, resonant boom that traveled through the hull and into their bones, and then something peculiar happened. Rather than panic, rather than the frenzy one might expect when a flagship of that magnitude suffered a direct hit, there fell across the Taiho a strange, almost ceremonial quietness. Damage control teams moved into motion with practiced efficiency, their drills as familiar as breathing. The wound was on the starboard side, and the flooding was contained, at least at first. The gash ran perhaps 40 feet along her hull, below the waterline, and the sea poured in with a patient, inevitable rhythm, but the pumps, those great mechanical hearts of the ship, held the water back. Commander Kiichi Hirose, who had served in the Taiho's engineering spaces and witnessed what occurred during those next critical hours, later described an almost dreamlike atmosphere below decks. Men worked without shouting. There was no panic, no frantic scrambling. The hierarchy held firm. Orders were relayed, acknowledged, executed. The damage seemed manageable. The captain, Mataji Morishita, made the calculated decision to continue flight operations. Protecting the fleet took precedence, and every moment of delay meant fewer aircraft aloft to attack the Americans. This was the calculus of naval warfare, and it was pursued even as seawater continued its inevitable seepage into the ship's compartments. What happened next, over the course of the hours that followed, remains somewhat uncertain in its precise mechanics, and historians have offered varying accounts based on the fragmentary testimonies that survived. The standard explanation centers on a critical error in damage control procedure. Someone in the engine room, perhaps seeking to help equalize pressure and slow the flooding, made the decision to activate the ventilation systems. Think of the Taiho not as a solid block of steel, but as a vast, interconnected system of passages and compartments, each sealed from the others by heavy doors and hatches. The ventilation brought air flowing through those spaces, and with that air came vapors, gasoline vapors, from the aviation fuel that was stored throughout the ship in numerous tanks, some of them ruptured by the initial explosion, some of them merely leaking their volatile contents into the superheated air. The calm continued, even as the danger accumulated invisibly. The Taiho's officers and engineers did not know, could not have known, that gasoline fumes were gathering in the darkness of her lower compartments, waiting like held breath. The ship remained operational, still launching and recovering aircraft, still fighting, still hoping. There was something almost meditative about the work of the crew during these hours. The repetition of damage control routines, the faith in their training, in their vessel, in their collective will to survive this encounter. And then, as evening approached, as the day wore on and the hours accumulated toward late afternoon, the nature of the crisis shifted in an instant. A small fire broke out in one of the compartments deep within the ship, or perhaps the electrical systems, damaged by the flooding, sparked at a crucial moment. No single person could say later with absolute certainty what triggered it. The Taiho's survivors would remember only that there came a sudden violent tremor through the hull, more violent than the torpedo strike itself, a convulsion that ran through the entire length of the ship from stem to stern. The ventilation systems that had been activated to help with damage control had, whether by accident or by some malevolent coincidence of circumstance, distributed those gasoline vapors throughout her inner passages, and in a fraction of a second, across a span of hundreds of feet within her hull, they ignited simultaneously. The explosion was not like the detonation of a bomb or a torpedo. It was something more wholesale, more encompassing. It was as though the ship herself had suddenly transformed into a kind of enormous, floating furnace. The crew members who were below decks in those compartments died instantly, their bodies never to be recovered, their names remembered only in the official rolls of the dead. Those on the upper decks felt the shock wave, saw the sky light up with an orange glow, smelled the sudden overwhelming reek of burning oil and vaporized metal. The ship listed, her angle to the water becoming more acute with each passing moment. Order dissolved into chaos, but it was a chaos that still retained a certain dignity, a certain Japanese restraint, even in catastrophe. Mataji Morishita, the captain, made the decision to abandon ship. There were not enough lifeboats. There was never enough on any of the great warships when the final moment came. The sailors and officers poured over the rails into the warm sea, still carrying with them the habits of hierarchy and obedience. The Taiho slipped beneath the surface, and as she did, the thousands of men who had served aboard her watched their home, their place of duty and camaraderie, disappear into the dark water. She took with her more than 1,000 souls, men whose lives had been bound together by chance and circumstance, and the choices made by admirals and politicians thousands of miles away. The flag that had overseen Operation Ago slipped beneath the waves with her. What remains haunting, when one reads the accounts of those who survived the Taiho's final moments, is the peculiar absence of what one might expect to find. There is little recrimination, little sense that someone had blundered catastrophically. There is instead a kind of resigned understanding, as though the outcome, once the torpedo struck, had already been written by larger forces beyond anyone's control. The ship had been damaged, had continued to function, and then had been undone by a sequence of events that no one in the moment could have predicted or prevented. The calm that had persisted through the first hours of damage control gave way to a calmer still, a kind of acceptance, as the ship went down. While the Taiho descended into chaos, another veteran was being hunted in the deeper waters nearby. The Shokaku had been alive since the war's very beginning. She had launched her aircraft against Pearl Harbor on that grey December morning, 3.5 years before, her pilots among the first to ignite American soil. Through nearly 4 years of combat, through dozens of engagements, through moments of triumph and increasing desperation, the Shokaku had endured. Her name meant soaring crane, a designation that once promised grace and swift movement. By June of 1944, she was no longer swift, and grace had become memory. The American submarine Kavala, moving silently through the Philippine Sea, carried no such historical weight in her own consciousness. She was simply hunting. Her captain, Herman Kostler, and his crew had been tracking the Japanese fleet through the day, waiting for their moment. For the submarine service, stealth was survival, and patience was victory. The Kavala had positioned herself in the depths, waiting for the fleet to pass overhead, waiting for the moment when a massive ship might come close enough. On the afternoon of June 19th, as the Shokaku turned in the water, performing her evasive maneuvers and trying to avoid the pattern of American attacks, the Kavala's sonarmen heard something that made them alert. A large contact, a carrier. The distance was closing. In the depths below the surface, there is no haste, no urgency in tone. Everything is methodical. Everything is certain. The Kavala's crew began their run, their submarine sliding into position, like a creature that has learned patience over millions of years of predatory existence. The Shokaku's officers were aware, on some level, that danger lay all around them. The morning's air battles had been devastating. Aircraft had returned, not all of them, and not with the pilots they had left with. The carrier herself had survived the morning's strikes, had turned hard, had dodged. But evasion, like luck, is not a permanent condition. It is only a temporary reprieve. As the afternoon deepened, some of the crew might have looked at the sky and wondered how long fortune could hold. Others focused on their tasks. In a ship, there is always work. There is always purpose. It is easier not to contemplate the nature of the waters in which you float. The Kavala fired. 4 torpedoes, released into the dark water, aimed at a course and a bearing and a hope. In the vast ocean, the probability of such a strike is always small. The ocean is large. Ships are small. But the Shokaku was not small, and on this afternoon, the geometry of war aligned. 2 of the 4 found their mark. The impacts, when they came, were not like the flash fires of aircraft bombs. They were deeper. They were underneath. The Shokaku shuddered. Damage reports began to flow through the ship's interior communications systems. Fires had started in the engine rooms. The starboard side was flooding. The great ship, which had travelled so far and endured so much, was wounded in a way from which she might not recover. What follows in the historical record is a curious interval. The Shokaku's captain ordered the ship to continue, to try to make for port, to attempt to salvage the vessel. Emergency parties fought the fires. Damage control teams worked through the compartments, sealing bulkheads, redirecting water, trying to contain what was spreading. This too is a kind of desperation, not the desperate action of panic, but the measured desperation of men who understand exactly how precarious their situation has become and are acting out the protocols of survival anyway, knowing all the while that protocols are often insufficient when they meet the true scale of catastrophe. Through the afternoon and into the evening, the Shokaku remained afloat, though listing, though burning in places, though taking on water despite all efforts. She was being towed. She was trying to limp away from the battle. But the sun was setting on a day when the entire battle had been decided by forces largely invisible. Submarines below, American carriers too far away to be seen, aircraft too swift to be counted accurately while they were still in the sky. The Shokaku's officers knew this now. They knew they had entered a new kind of warfare, one where the skill of individual sailors and the courage of individual pilots mattered less than the industrial capacity of the nation that built the replacements for the ships and pilots you lost. Japan had fewer ships to lose. Japan had fewer pilots being trained. Japan could not build enough aircraft carriers. These truths, which had been true for some time, were becoming visible now in ways that could not be denied. That evening, as darkness settled fully over the Philippine Sea, the Shokaku was still afloat. She was still burning. She was still taking on water. And at 9 o'clock in the evening, as if some final indignity were required to complete the arc of her day, a series of secondary explosions began deep within her. The fuel fires, perhaps. The ammunition magazines, perhaps. Or perhaps it was simply the ship breaking apart under the stress of water and fire and the weight of her own structure. The truth of how any ship finally dies is often understood only by the ship herself. The Shokaku sank. She went down into the darkness. And with her went not merely a vessel of steel and machinery, but a symbol that reached back to the opening of the war, a witness to the moment when Japan believed it could dominate the Pacific and all the years of increasingly difficult truth that had followed. The loss carried weight among those who knew the ship's history. The Shokaku had not been a flagship or the most famous of the Japanese carriers, but she had been there. She had launched her aircraft when the war was young and Japan still believed in triumph. She had survived battles that destroyed other ships. She had endured, and now she was gone, sunk not in a dramatic last stand or in a moment of heroic sacrifice, but in the confusion of a day when the traditional rules of naval warfare had already been superseded by invisible weapons and forces that could not be defeated by bravery or skill or determination alone. The crews who had served on her, who had walked her decks, who knew the specific sounds of her engines and the particular way she handled in rough seas, those men were now scattered. Some had been rescued, some had been lost in the water, some would survive the war, some would not. The ship herself existed now only in memory and in the logbooks that would, in the decades to come, document her passage from the living roster of the Imperial Japanese Navy to the inventory of history. The morning light that broke across the horizon on that 19th day brought no comfort to the young men climbing into their cockpits. They had trained for this moment, some of them for years, yet as the deck crews guided aircraft into position and the great carrier decks trembled with the electricity of preparation, many of these pilots harbored a quiet knowledge that would never be spoken aloud. The odds had begun to shift, not in a way that could be measured on a map or calculated in official tallies, but in the small, almost invisible ways that experience recognizes. The newer pilots among them had fewer hours of flight time than their American counterparts. The rotation of veteran aviators through training squadrons had created gaps in the chain of mastery that could not be quickly repaired, and yet they climbed into their seats anyway, settling into the familiar cramped geometry of the cockpit, running through procedures that had become as natural as breath. Wave after wave lifted skyward that morning. The pilots knew they were flying with an advantage that seemed clear on paper. The range of their aircraft was greater. Their engines could carry them farther than the American Hellcats that waited somewhere beyond the horizon. Admiral Ozawa had calculated this carefully. The first strike would fall upon the American fleet, while the enemy aircraft still sat upon distant decks. There was elegance to the logic, a neat geometric precision, but geometry collapses when it meets reality. The American radar, which many Japanese pilots barely understood, existed in any sophisticated form, had already painted their approach on screens 30 miles away. The Hellcats did not need to guess where the Japanese were coming. They rose to meet them with a precision that spoke of abundant fuel, abundant ammunition, and pilots who had not been flying combat patrols for 3 years straight. And there, in that moment of collision, something fundamental revealed itself. A pilot from the Shokaku, one of the few who survived to speak of it later, described the first encounter with words that seemed almost dreamy, perhaps because trauma has a way of rendering itself in slow motion. He spoke of seeing the American fighters suddenly materialize, not below him as expected, but above and around him, as if the sky itself had reorganized in an instant. The Hellcat could climb faster, it could turn more tightly at altitude. These were not matters of opinion or interpretation. They were physical laws written in the movements of metal through air. The pilots had known this intellectually, knowing it in the moment, as an enemy fighter's guns drew a line of tracer fire across your canopy, was something else entirely. The losses began almost immediately. Not in the measured way that military engagements sometimes unfold, with casualties accumulating gradually across hours. These were rapid, cascading losses. Japanese aircraft fell into the sea like leaves falling from a great tree in autumn, spinning and tumbling, disappearing into blue water. The pilots who escaped those first encounters turned back toward the fleet, some carrying reports of what they had encountered, others so shaken by the experience that coherent communication became difficult. The deck crews watched them return, noticing how many aircraft came back damaged, how few completed their ammunition loads. Of the strike aircraft that had launched that morning, the number that reached the American fleet was far smaller than the sortie count had suggested would occur. Yet still the waves continued. Through the morning, pilot after pilot was briefed, given their heading, sent aloft into danger. There was no choice, really. The plan had been set in motion. The commitment had been made. One must imagine the psychological weight of this, the steady march of men into circumstances where the probability of their return had become, by the middle hours of that day, disturbingly low. Some kept journals, some wrote hasty letters to wives and mothers, sealed envelopes to be posted if the worst occurred. Others simply sat quietly in the ready rooms, listening to the sound of aircraft engines and the distant percussion of anti-aircraft fire. The American gunners, meanwhile, were experiencing something closer to target practice. Rarely in naval warfare does a defending fleet enjoy such overwhelming advantage. The American Hellcats held the altitude, they held the position. They had ammunition in abundance, and pilots who had trained for precisely these conditions. The radar guided the fighters with remarkable precision. A Japanese pilot climbing through a cloud bank might emerge to find American fighters already positioned to capitalize on his disadvantage. It was not a battle in any traditional sense. It was an asymmetry so profound that some of the pilots who lived through it struggled to describe it as combat at all. There is a question that emerges from the records of that day, one that historians have approached with some delicacy. Were the Japanese pilots at a disadvantage of training, of equipment, of tactics, or all of these simultaneously? The most honest answer, drawn from the accounts of survivors and the documents collected after the war, is yes. Yes to all of it. The average Japanese naval pilot of 1944 had fewer total flight hours than the average American counterpart. The aircraft themselves, while capable and in some respects elegant designs, were not as robust or as versatile as the Hellcat. The tactical doctrine that governed their engagement was based on assumptions about air superiority that had been rendered obsolete by the revolution in radar technology. And perhaps most importantly, the replacements for experienced aviators had not been trained with sufficient rigor or duration to compensate for the knowledge that had been lost when the veterans fell. By the time the afternoon arrived, the scale of the catastrophe had become apparent, even to those still launching from the deck. The signal that was passed between aircraft, the radio chatter captured by those monitoring frequencies, spoke of heavy losses. Entire formations were reported missing. Individual pilots, somehow finding their way back to the fleet, described scenarios in which they had seen no enemy at all before their aircraft were struck by fire from positions they could not determine. Some of them spoke of American aircraft that seemed to materialize from nowhere, positioned with such precision that it suggested a level of coordination that seemed almost supernatural. Of course, it was not supernatural. It was science, it was technology, and it was the accumulated advantage of an industrial power that had spent 3 years perfecting the systems of naval air warfare, while Japan's capacity to innovate and improve had been steadily consumed by the need simply to sustain operations. The pilots themselves, what can be said of their experience? Many of them were young, some were very young. They had grown up in a culture that had emphasized sacrifice and duty and the transcendent power of will and spirit. They had been told that technology could be overcome by determination, that American materiel could be defeated by Japanese courage. And courage, certainly, they possessed in abundance. But courage and wisdom are not always the same thing, nor is courage sufficient when ranged against overwhelming disadvantage. The records suggest that the pilots who flew that day did so with full awareness of what they were likely to encounter. Many of them did not return. By evening, the scale of the air losses had become clear to even the most optimistic observers on the deck. The American fleet had withdrawn before the Japanese strike could reach them. Admiral Ozawa's plan, which had depended on the first strike destroying enough American aircraft and ships to shift the balance, had failed before it could be properly executed. The pilots had done what they could do. Some of them had reached the American fleet. Some of them had managed to inflict damage, but the mathematics had been against them from the beginning, and now, as the sun settled toward the horizon on that 19th day of June, there was a growing sense aboard the Japanese carriers that the morning's losses could not be easily replaced. The pilots who might have been trained to fill those empty cockpits simply did not exist. The aircraft that might have been built to replace those that had fallen into the sea were being constructed in factories that did not have sufficient resources. The reserves of experienced aviators, already thin, had been thinned further. What history would later call the Marianas Turkey Shoot, a name that carries the peculiar callousness of American victory, was not a battle in any traditional sense. It was the visible manifestation of a deeper imbalance that had been accumulating for months, perhaps for years. The pilots of the Japanese fleet had flown as well as skill and courage could fly. They had done so knowing, or at least suspecting, that the advantage lay with the enemy, and they had fallen in numbers that were difficult to accept, even for those who understood the logic of attrition. By the time the last aircraft of the day had either landed or failed to land, over 300 Japanese pilots and aircrewmen had been lost. The American losses were approximately a tenth of that number. The pilots launching from those carriers on the morning of June 19th carried with them the accumulated weight of 3 years of unrelenting attrition. When you begin to trace backward through the records, the combat reports, the pilot rosters, the sparse surviving interviews, there emerges a picture far more troubling than any single defeat could suggest. Japan's Naval Aviation Corps had been hollowed from within, not by any single catastrophic moment, but by the slow, inexorable mathematics of war. Consider for a moment what had transpired since that December morning at Pearl Harbor. In those first 12 months of the Pacific War, Japan had indeed achieved something remarkable. The conquest of vast territories, the sinking of battleships, the demonstration of carrier power that seemed, to many observers, unmatched in the world. The Japanese pilots who flew those early missions were, by and large, experienced men. They had trained during the long years of the China campaign. They had logged hundreds of hours. They understood not merely how to fly, but how to survive in the air. They knew the weight of a machine, the limits of its turn, the subtle whisper of an engine about to fail. They had something that cannot be taught in a classroom or a training field, the knowledge that comes only from having lived through combat and returned home to fly again. But here lies the paradox that haunted the Japanese Navy as June of 1944 approached. The men who possessed that invaluable experience were, by now, largely dead. The Battle of the Coral Sea had taken some, Midway had taken far more, and these were not replaceable losses, for Midway had claimed many of the Navy's most senior, most experienced formation leaders. Guadalcanal had become an endless grinding machine, a furnace into which pilot after pilot was fed. The campaigns in the Central Pacific, the skirmishes over the Philippines, the endless interception missions, each one claimed lives. And Japan, unlike the United States, had made a choice, decades earlier, about how to handle its pilots. There was no rotation system. A pilot flew until he was killed, or, very rarely, unless badly wounded, was reassigned to training duties. There was no mechanism for removing experienced men from combat to serve as instructors, to pass along their knowledge to the next generation. The American approach was, in hindsight, one of those strategic decisions that seemed almost mundane at the time, but which held within it the seeds of decisive advantage. American pilots, once they had accumulated sufficient combat experience, perhaps 50 missions, perhaps more depending on circumstances, were often rotated home. They returned to training fields and academies. They taught younger pilots the lessons they had learned in blood and fire. The knowledge stayed within the system. It accumulated, rather than evaporating. Japan made the opposite choice. The reasoning was perhaps understandable within its own cultural framework. The idea that a pilot's duty was to continue until death, that rotation might be seen as a form of cowardice or betrayal. But the strategic consequence was catastrophic. As the experienced pilots died, and they did, steadily, relentlessly, they took with them their knowledge. The men being trained to replace them were, of necessity, trained by whoever remained, often men who themselves had only recently survived. The depth of expertise diminished with each cycle. By 1944, if one looks at the available records, a pattern emerges that speaks volumes without ever raising its voice. The pilot shortage was acute. Production of new aircraft was actually reasonably robust. Japan continued to manufacture planes, sometimes in surprising numbers. But pilots were another matter entirely. The training pipeline had been deliberately designed around the assumption of a short war. Cadets who might once have spent a year or more in intensive preparation were now being cycled through abbreviated courses. Some had fewer than 50 hours of flight time before being assigned to frontline units. Some had never flown from a carrier before taking a position in a carrier squadron. These were not men who would be called poorly trained. They were doing their best under impossible circumstances, but they were simply not the equal of pilots with 3 years of accumulated experience. Consider what that means in the context of aerial combat. The difference between a pilot with 200 hours and one with 50 hours is not merely quantitative. It is the difference between someone who has internalized the machine, who responds to its movements with instinct, and someone who must still think consciously about each adjustment. It is the difference between a pilot who can spare mental energy for observation, for spotting enemy aircraft at distance, for planning tactics, and one who is simply trying to keep his plane in the air. In combat, that difference is often measured in seconds, and seconds are the currency in which life is traded for death. There is something worth pondering here, something that the records hint at but do not quite articulate. How did the young pilots themselves understand the situation? Some must have known, on some level, that they were inheriting a diminished legacy. Some must have sensed that the men they flew alongside, the flight leaders whose instructions they followed, were themselves not as weathered as the stories suggested. Others perhaps did not think about it at all, holding instead to the spiritual philosophy that would soon be invoked repeatedly, the belief that courage and determination could overcome any material disadvantage. The Japanese Navy kept meticulous records during this period, in the tradition of military documentation, but those records, when examined from certain angles, read almost like a statistical portrait of decline. Squadron rosters from 1942 and those from 1944 tell a story in their very structure. The names change, of course. The dead have been replaced by newcomers, but the average hours of pilot experience drops. The ratio of fully combat-qualified pilots to newer men shifts noticeably. The number of pilots rated as excellent or very good dwindles. This was not due to any falling away of courage or character, but simply to the brutal arithmetic of attrition operating in a system with no mechanism for replenishment and training. There had been, in fact, occasional voices within the Japanese Navy who recognized this problem. Some commanders had attempted to establish advanced training centers, had tried to rotate experienced pilots into instructional roles, but these initiatives were modest, and they had come too late. The damage had already accumulated beyond what could be easily repaired. By 1944, the machine was what it was, still formidable on paper, still commanded by determined and capable officers, still equipped with aircraft that were, in many respects, the equal of American fighters, but crewed by men, increasingly, who had not had time to fully master their craft. One must be careful here not to overstate the case, or to suggest that the pilots of the mobile fleet were incompetent. The records show that individual pilots achieved remarkable feats on June 19th and the days that followed. There were skilled flyers present, men who had learned their trade well despite shortened training. But there were also many, perhaps most, who were simply young men doing their best with limited preparation. The variance in skill level within Japanese squadrons was likely wider than it had been in earlier years. Some pilots were excellent, others were adequate, still others were barely adequate. This unevenness would have consequences. What happened over the Philippine Sea in those days was, in part, a manifestation of this structural weakness. It was not that the Japanese plan was fundamentally unsound, or that Ozawa's leadership was poor. It was rather that the human material upon which the plan depended, the pilots who would fly the aircraft, who would navigate vast stretches of ocean, who would find and strike the American fleet, and who would return safely, that material had been depleted in a way that was almost irreversible. The training gap, as some historians have called it, was not a narrow thing that might be bridged with additional supplies or equipment. It was a chasm that had been opening for 2 years and more, and by the time the fleet sailed westward toward the Marianas, that chasm was very deep indeed. The morning of June 20th dawned with a peculiar absence. The Japanese fleet had launched its aircraft the day before, watched them disappear into the eastern sky with prayers, and practiced discipline, and now waited through the dragging hours for word of what had struck the Americans, what fires burned across their carrier decks, what carriers might never sail again. But the reports that returned were not the ones Admiral Ozawa had written into his plans. They spoke instead of losses. They spoke of aircraft that did not return. They spoke of pilots who would not be coming home, their voices fading from the radio until there was only static and the vast, indifferent ocean. By afternoon, the Japanese fleet found itself in a strange state of suspension, neither victory nor defeat yet confirmed, suspended in the realm of uncertainty, where military minds grow restless and doubt begins to whisper through the steel corridors of the ships. Ozawa still held hope. He had committed his fleet to this battle for a reason. The Americans had landed on Saipan, and Japan could not allow that to stand unchallenged. The doctrine called for a decisive engagement, a single crushing blow that would tip the scales of the war back toward equilibrium, however briefly. But the hours had passed now without that clarity of triumph. The fleet steamed through relatively calm waters, the noise of the engines a steady undercurrent beneath the sounds of men working, of damage control crews attending to wounds the fleet had sustained, of voices speaking in hushed, measured tones about what might come next. By late afternoon, the lookouts on the Japanese ships began scanning the western horizon with increased intensity. Where was the American fleet? The fundamental question that had driven the entire operation now became more urgent with each passing hour. The Japanese had sailed into these waters expecting to find the Americans at a particular distance, to utilize their superior aircraft range for an opening strike before the Americans could respond in kind. But naval warfare, like all war, is riddled with the unreliability of expectations. The Americans might have moved, they might have turned, they might have run north or south along invisible corridors, only they understood. Ozawa needed to find them before darkness fell completely, needed to launch another strike before the day's remaining light evaporated into the Pacific dusk. There existed in that afternoon moment a particular quality of tension, not the acute, explosive anxiety of combat itself, but rather the grinding, patient tension of the hunted searching for the hunter. The Japanese knew by now that something had gone terribly wrong with the previous day's assault. The surviving pilots had spoken of American anti-aircraft fire unlike anything they had encountered, of American fighters meeting them at altitudes they had not anticipated, of coordinated defenses that suggested the Americans possessed information, technology, or simply superior tactical positioning. Some pilots spoke in their debriefings of radar, of electronic sensing that allowed the Americans to see without eyes. The concept was almost mythological to many of the Japanese officers, this invisible wall of detection that pushed back against their strikes like an invisible hand. But mythology or not, the effect was devastatingly real. As the afternoon wore on, and still no confirmed sighting of the American fleet crystallized into certainty, a kind of weariness settled into the Japanese ships. The men had been in a state of heightened readiness for hours. The pilots who had survived the morning's battles lay in makeshift recovery areas, some sleeping the unconscious sleep of the utterly exhausted, others staring at ceilings and replaying moments in their minds. Moments where friends' aircraft simply ceased to exist, where wingmen called out one final transmission before going silent forever. The crews worked through their duties with the mechanical precision of those who have trained so thoroughly that action becomes a form of meditation. Load ammunition, check systems, scan the sky, wait. The gunnery officers and lookouts maintained their posts with practiced vigilance, knowing that the Americans might appear at any moment from any direction. The American task forces under Admiral Mitchell possessed their own momentum, their own plans and tactical logic. The Japanese were learning, through the unforgiving experience of actual battle, that the ocean was larger than any single fleet's ability to control it, that finding an enemy in the vastness of the Pacific required luck as much as skill, and that luck, as always, was a commodity in desperately short supply. The fleet's communication systems remained active, carrying reports from reconnaissance aircraft, from picket ships stationed outward in the perimeter, from every eye and instrument they could orient toward the west and south, searching for the silhouettes of American carriers. And then, as the sun began its inevitable descent toward the horizon, painting the western sky in shades that seemed almost too beautiful to exist in the midst of war, golds deepening into oranges, crimsons blooming at the edges, the reports began to come through. American carriers sighted, American fleet located. The position was relayed through the ships, repeated in voices that carried the peculiar mixture of confirmation and dread. After the entire grinding day of uncertainty, after the hours of waiting and wondering, the Americans had finally been found. They were there, to the west, perhaps 150 miles distant, a difficult range for a strike at this hour, with darkness approaching rapidly, with only the last margin of daylight remaining for any aircraft to fly out, find their targets, and ideally, make their way back to the fleet before navigation became impossible. Yet for Ozawa and his staff, the choice crystallized into something almost inevitable. They had not journeyed this far into the Pacific to leave the Americans untouched. The doctrine of decisive battle still held sway. The fleet had already suffered significant losses. The Taiho and Shokaku had gone down the day before, sunk not by aircraft, but by submarines moving through the depths like ghosts. Those carriers had represented irreplaceable capacity, irreplaceable expertise, irreplaceable continuity with the fleet's history and tradition. The younger carriers still with the fleet, the newer ships that had joined after Midway and Guadalcanal, carried pilots who were less experienced than those who had gone down. But they were all that remained. To turn away now, to let the Americans consolidate their position, to allow the landings on Saipan to proceed unopposed. This was a kind of defeat that seemed to violate everything the fleet had been sent out to prevent. The order went out to prepare for a late afternoon evening strike. Aircraft were armed and fueled. The remaining pilots, some of them already exhausted from the morning's battles, began moving toward their aircraft. This would be their last opportunity to alter the equation of this battle. The American fleet lay beyond the horizon, tantalizingly within reach, yet so far away that getting there and back in the failing light would require flying blind on the return journey, relying on instruments and luck and the desperate hope that they could find their own fleet in the darkness. For a pilot in the Japanese Navy in June of 1944, this was an accepted risk, perhaps even an expected price of commitment. But it was a risk nonetheless, and as the aircraft began to taxi for takeoff, as the engines turned up to their full, fierce howling, as the first waves launched from the darkening flight decks into the amber and purple sky, everyone aboard the remaining Japanese carriers understood that they were committing not only aircraft and weapons, but the last coherent resource they possessed, the lives of young men who were, in many ways, irreplaceable now. The search itself, that long afternoon of uncertainty followed by the confirmation at last, had created a particular psychological state within the fleet. There was relief at having found the enemy. There was also a mounting sense that time, always an enemy in warfare, was now pressing heavily against them. The darkness would come soon, the moment would pass, and after this strike, if it failed, if the Americans survived this final assault and turned their full attention onto the Japanese fleet, there would be very few cards left to play. The afternoon light had begun its slow descent toward the western horizon, when the lookouts aboard the Japanese fleet reported what they had been waiting for, with a strange mixture of dread and relief. The American carrier force, at last, had been located. They were not where Ozawa had hoped they would be, not within the extended range that his pilots had trained to exploit, but they were there, and the admiral, facing the steady accumulation of losses through the day, saw in this distant sighting a final opportunity. What remained of the mobile fleet's air strength would be committed in one desperate, fading strike. It would be launched so late in the day that the aircraft, if they survived the encounter, would have to find their way back to their carriers in gathering darkness. For a naval aviator in 1944, this was not merely a tactical disadvantage. It was often a death sentence. The order rippled through the remaining carriers, pilots who had spent the day in a kind of suspended waiting, alternating between the ready rooms and brief moments of solitude where they might write letters or sit in quiet prayer, were now called to their aircraft once more. There was an exhaustion in these movements, though observers noted it was not the exhaustion of fear alone, it was the bone-deep tiredness of men who had already flown multiple sorties, who had witnessed friends disappear into the sea, who had heard the constant drone of alarms and the metallic percussion of damage control parties working against the clock. The mechanics checked fuel lines and ammunition feeds with the methodical care of people performing rituals they had performed 1,000 times before, knowing that small oversights now might mean the difference between a pilot's return and his vanishing into the vastness of the Pacific. The aircraft themselves, many of them bearing the patches and scars of previous engagements, were lined up on the flight decks like weary warriors being prepared for one final march. As the sun slipped lower, painting the cloud banks in shades of amber and deep crimson, the Japanese aircraft began to lift away from the carriers. The sound of their engines, a sound that had once filled the pilots and crews with a fierce pride, now carried a different resonance. It was the sound of a commitment made without certainty of return. Ozawa watched from the bridge of his flagship, a man bearing the weight of decisions that could not be unmade, observing the aircraft diminish into the distance, with eyes that had seen the transformation of Japanese naval power from dominance to desperation across 3 years of war. The search was on, the final roll of dice cast across the darkening sky. But as twilight deepened and the Japanese strike force moved toward their target, something was already shifting in the American fleet's disposition. The American commanders, with superior radar and radio intelligence, were aware of the approaching threat. Fighters were being scrambled. Anti-aircraft crews were moving into position. The defensive machinery of the American Navy, honed through months of Pacific combat, was winding itself tighter, and beyond the immediate tactical picture, forces were already in motion that would ensure this final Japanese strike would not develop as Ozawa had conceived it. The engagement that followed, when the Japanese aircraft and American defenders met in that confused twilight realm where day and night struggle for dominion, was brief and devastating. Japanese pilots, many of them relatively inexperienced by the standards of the fleet's earlier campaigns, pressed their attacks against American carriers already alert and maneuvering. The anti-aircraft fire that rose to meet them was overwhelming, a textured wall of steel and explosive fury that turned the sky into a kind of burning maze. Aircraft fell. Some fell quickly, struck cleanly, and tumbling from the sky like wounded birds. Others caught fire and continued forward for a few seconds more before succumbing to gravity and impact. The pilots who survived the defensive fire and managed to press home their attacks achieved some damage. Hits registered, fires started, but nothing that would alter the fundamental momentum of the battle. And now, as full darkness descended, a new and more terrible reckoning began to take shape. The Japanese aircraft that had survived the initial engagement faced a choice that was no choice at all. They could not find their way home. The vast distances of the Pacific, the darkness, the absence of reliable navigation systems, the simple human difficulty of identifying one's own fleet in a moonless night, these conspired to transform the Japanese pilots into ghosts. Some turned westward, searching for the silhouettes of their own carriers against the star-scattered sky. Others attempted to find any Japanese ship, hoping at least for rescue in the water. Many simply flew until their fuel was exhausted, and then made the decision, in those final moments of consciousness, whether to attempt a crash landing, to bail out into the darkness, or to accept the quiet inevitability of their fate. The sea that night received them in great numbers. Behind them, Ozawa's fleet was beginning its retreat. The admiral had seen enough through the course of this day, had absorbed sufficient intelligence, witnessed sufficient losses, understood with a clarity that transcended hope, to know that the gamble had failed. The American fleet remained intact and powerful. The Japanese had lost their aircraft and the pilots to fly them. The strategic position that had seemed so urgent that morning had become, by evening, indefensible. The order was given to reverse course, to head westward, to salvage what remained of the Mobile fleet. It was, in its way, an admission. Not a surrender, that would come later, but a recognition that the moment for decisive victory had passed, that the long curve of Japanese naval power that had arced so brilliantly across the first years of the Pacific War had now definitively begun its descent. But even in retreat, there could be no rest, no respite. The American task force, with its night fighter capability and its aggressive commanders, pursued the withdrawing Japanese ships. The darkness that had been an enemy to the Japanese pilots now became a strange and intermittent ally. Some Japanese vessels managed to slip away into the night relatively unscathed. Others were caught by American aircraft launched from carriers that could operate in conditions that would have grounded the Japanese fleet entirely. Flares illuminated the Japanese ships, turning night back into a kind of terrible day, and in that sickly artificial light, American pilots dove on their targets. Explosions bloomed along the horizon. Ships that had survived the main battle now found themselves wounded or mortally damaged. The Japanese were not fleeing in panic. There was too much discipline, too much training, too much honor embedded in the structure of these fleets for anything so crude as panic. But they were fleeing, and they were suffering as they went. There was a particular poignancy in the scenes that unfolded across those dark waters. The Japanese sailors aboard the surviving carriers watched their comrades' vessels burn. They heard the cries of men in the water, though distance and darkness prevented rescue in most cases. They received reports from damage control parties, from lookouts, from pilots, an accumulating catalogue of loss. Officers moved through the passageways and around the gun emplacements with faces that revealed nothing of the internal states that must have been churning beneath. This was war, as the Japanese understood it, not glorious, not the triumph of spirit over matter that the propagandists promised, but rather a grinding, inexorable reduction of capability and of hope. And yet the fleet kept moving, kept its formation, kept its discipline. In the strange economy of Japanese military culture, the manner in which one retreated mattered. The way one bore witness to catastrophe mattered. These were the codes by which officers and enlisted men alike had been trained to navigate the abyss. The wreckage on the horizon, the burning oil, the illuminated columns of smoke, the occasional sudden flash when ammunition magazines detonated, created a visual landscape of ending. Japanese sailors who looked toward that burning wreckage understood, in a way that transcended any official announcement, that something fundamental had shifted. This was not the victory that had been promised. This was not even a battle that might yet be redeemed through some subsequent engagement. This was a defeat, complete and unambiguous, even if no one would speak the word aloud for some days yet. The ocean, indifferent and vast, received the losses, both the ships and the men, and would hold them in its depths through the decades that would follow. As the Japanese fleet moved steadily westward through the night, carrying its survivors and its wounded toward whatever refuge might be found in the home islands or in the shrinking territory of the Japanese sphere, the officers and men aboard those ships might have allowed themselves, in the privacy of their thoughts, to consider what this night meant. The mobile fleet, which had been conceived as the instrument of strategic victory, had been reduced to the status of a refugee convoy. Ozawa, bearing the responsibility for these losses, continued to direct the movements of his remaining vessels with the professional composure demanded by his rank and station. But even he, one might imagine, was beginning to process the full weight of what had occurred. The Taiho was gone, the Shokaku was gone, the Shoho was lost earlier in the day. Dozens of aircraft had been sent forth and never returned. And most significantly, another generation of trained naval aviators had been effectively destroyed in the space of a few hours. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, viewed from the American perspective, would be remembered as a triumph, a demonstration of superior doctrine, superior equipment, superior training, and superior industrial capacity. But viewed from the Japanese side, particularly from the vantage point of those aboard the retreating carriers, it was something far more complex. It was the moment when the long accumulation of losses and disadvantages became impossible to deny. It was the moment when even the most disciplined and devoted officer began to understand that no amount of resolution or spiritual commitment could bridge the gap that had opened between Japanese capability and American capability. The night air was thick with diesel smoke and salt spray. The decks of the surviving carriers bore the marks of the day's violence, and somewhere out in that darkness, many hundreds of Japanese sailors floated in the water, their lives ending, not in glory, but in cold confusion, their bodies joining the countless others that the Pacific had claimed since that December morning when Pearl Harbor was attacked. The American night attacks had turned what remained of Ozawa's mobile fleet into a collection of burning platforms scattered across hundreds of square miles of the Philippine Sea. As darkness settled across the water, the order came down, not in panic, but with the measured tone of commanders who knew there was nothing left to defend against in the moment. Retreat westward, take what is seaworthy, leave nothing to the Americans but wreckage and the names of the lost. The withdrawal began in the deep hours after midnight. Ships that could still generate sufficient steam began their slow turn toward home, their silhouettes moving like wounded animals leaving a hunting ground. The Zuikaku, one of the 3 original carriers that had survived this far, limped forward with fires still burning in her superstructure. The Haruna and Congo, battleships that had spent the entire battle far from the action, now formed a protective screen for what little remained of the air arm. But there were no more aircraft to protect. Most had been lost over the previous 2 days, in the air, in the water, or simply burned into ash on the flight decks of ships that would themselves soon sink. What the retreating fleet left behind was something far more difficult to account for than tonnage lost or naval vessels sent to the bottom. It was the problem of human beings in the water, sailors clinging to wreckage, pilots who had ejected or ditched when their fuel ran out or their engines began to fail, mechanics and deck crews and cooks and signalmen, all the invisible machinery of a fleet, now scattered across the dark ocean, waiting in the chill hours before dawn, wondering if rescue would come at all. The Japanese Navy had never developed a comprehensive rescue doctrine, which is a way of saying that men in the water, by and large, were expected to take their chances. There were no dedicated rescue vessels in the traditional sense, no ships whose only purpose was to patrol a battlefield and retrieve survivors. What rescue efforts existed happened piecemeal, when individual commanders made decisions to stop, or slow, or send a boat out into the darkness. The submarine threat made even these decisions fraught with tension. To stop, or to linger near survivors, was to invite American torpedoes. The calculus was brutal and simple. The living could not be saved if the ship died trying to save them. And yet men tried. In the smaller destroyers and cruisers, in fast transports and support vessels that had managed to stay afloat, captains and crew members made the harder choice. They stopped. They turned their vessels into the darkness toward the sounds of voices calling from the water. They dropped lines and nets and hung their arms out over the rails, reaching down to pull up men who were often barely conscious from cold and shock, and the fumes from burning oil that had settled across the surface of the sea. The accounts from that night carry a strange quality. They speak of exhaustion and stillness rather than urgency. Men who were pulled aboard often describe a dreamlike state, a separation from their own bodies. One survivor, a young pilot whose aircraft had gone down hours earlier, remembered the shock of hands grabbing his flight jacket, the sensation of being hauled upward through layers of water and darkness and oil, and then the peculiar warmth of being on the deck of a destroyer, where other men wrapped him in blankets and gave him water and asked no questions, because there was simply no energy left in anyone for proper interrogation. The water itself seemed to have turned cold in a way that suggested the Philippine Sea understood what had happened here. Modern researchers have noted that water temperature in that region in mid-June hovers around 26 to 27 degrees Celsius, warm by ocean standards, but cool enough to drain heat from an exhausted human body in the course of several hours. Add to that the psychological weight of being abandoned, the reasonable fear that dawn would bring American aircraft and more death, and many of the men floating in the darkness simply gave up. They were found later, sometimes by their own ships, sometimes by American vessels that had their own orders about rescue, more complex and humanitarian than those that guided the Japanese, though American rescue efforts were themselves constrained by the demands of warfare and the need to maintain tactical advantage. The night stretched. In one area of the sea, perhaps 5 or 6 miles from where the Taiho had gone down, a cluster of men remained afloat on pieces of the carrier's hull and on various raft structures. They had established a loose order among themselves, officers and senior enlisted men taking informal counts, checking on the weaker swimmers, rationing the little fresh water that some had managed to preserve. In the way that men do when facing extraordinary circumstances, they spoke quietly. There were prayers. There were long silences broken only by the lap of water against the wooden spars they clung to, and, in the distance, the sound of ships' engines as the Japanese fleet continued its westward passage. For those aboard the departing vessels, there was a different kind of exhaustion. The crews who had spent the day in combat stations, running ammunition, fighting fires, standing watch on gun mounts and in engine rooms, were now operating on reserves they didn't know they had. Many had not slept in more than 24 hours. Some had not eaten, or had eaten only the hard biscuits and cups of tea that could be rushed to positions during the chaos of battle. The pilots who returned, the handful who did, moved like men walking through water. They debriefed their intelligence officers with monotone voices, reporting positions and enemy movements that already belonged to the past. They accepted congratulations with blank expressions, because the cognitive space to feel pride or satisfaction, or even grief, had been consumed by simple survival and the need to remain upright and functional. The withdrawal continued through the hours of darkness. By the time the first light of dawn began to appear in the eastern sky, the mobile fleet had moved perhaps 40 nautical miles from the scene of the worst battles. The ships that had turned back to make rescue attempts had collected perhaps 300 survivors, a number so small relative to the 5,000 or more men lost from the carriers alone that it seemed almost to underscore the impossibility of the task. The available rescue capacity had been overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster, and there was no time to linger now. The American task force was known to be in the vicinity, and the only security available to the Japanese was speed and distance, and the hope that American commanders would choose consolidation over pursuit. What makes the accounts of that retreat particularly poignant is the quality of resignation that runs through them. The men who had survived the battle, whether in the water or aboard ship, seemed to understand, without being told, that something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer the mobile fleet of recent memory, no longer the force that had operated with any sense of dominance in the waters they were now abandoning. They were remnants. They were moving homeward not in triumph or even in the hope of regrouping for another strike, but in the recognition that this campaign had ended, and that what came next would be a long, grinding defense of an empire that was contracting, inch by inch, toward the Japanese home islands themselves. In the days that followed, as the surviving ships limped back towards Saipan and the southern reaches of the Philippine Sea, a peculiar silence fell over the command structures of what remained of Japan's mobile fleet. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of a recognition that something fundamental had broken, something that could not be repaired by repairing ships or training new pilots. It was the silence of men confronting the exhaustion of a doctrine that had no answer to the mathematics arrayed against it. The strategic architects in Tokyo and Admiral Ozawa himself were forced to reckon with a truth that had been gathering like storm clouds across the entire Pacific War. The battle had been fought and lost, not primarily because of tactical miscalculation, though there had been those, but because the underlying assumption upon which Japan's naval strategy rested had been proven hollow. That assumption was simple and, in retrospect, almost poignant in its vulnerability. That superior skill, superior courage, and superior spiritual resolve could overcome superior numbers and superior industrial capacity. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had torn that assumption to shreds. The men who studied the battle in its aftermath found themselves returning again and again to a single, inescapable fact. Japan had begun this war with perhaps the finest naval aviation force in the world. The pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor were graduates of a system that demanded thousands of hours in the air, constant practice, relentless refinement. Each man who climbed into a cockpit carried with him years of accumulated experience. But wars of attrition have a peculiar cruelty. They do not reward skill alone, they reward numbers. And when a pilot who has flown 500 hours falls from the sky over the Philippine Sea, there is no apprentice with 500 hours waiting to take his place. There is, instead, a young man with perhaps 50 hours of training, or fewer, climbing into the cockpit with his hands trembling and his mind searching for answers that experience alone could provide. This hemorrhaging of experience had been occurring for 3 years, accelerating with each campaign. The battles around Guadalcanal had taken hundreds of Japan's most experienced aviators. The attrition at Rabaul, at Truk, in the defense of ever-contracting zones of control, each engagement had drained away veterans without the possibility of true replacement. Japan's training pipeline, which had never been designed to replace losses on this scale, had become a system for throwing half-trained men into the air to meet better-trained men in better machines. It was a calculus that could only end in one way. The American pilots, by contrast, had benefited from a system that seemed almost designed for a war of attrition. When an American pilot had completed a tour of combat duty, he was sent home. He trained new pilots. He became an instructor, carrying his knowledge forward into the next generation. This meant that American aviation units never lost their backbone of experienced leaders. The skill set expanded rather than contracted. And as American industry ramped up production month by month, quarter by quarter, America was able to introduce new pilots to the fight in numbers that matched the expanding production of new aircraft. Japan, by the time of the Philippine Sea, was attempting to do the opposite, to maintain a pretense of naval aviation capability with a pilot corps whose average experience had plummeted catastrophically. Some historians, writing long after the war, would speculate gently about what might have happened if Japan had been willing to accept a different kind of strategic thinking earlier in the conflict. What if, they wondered, the battle had been viewed not as a test of naval aviation doctrine, but as a symptom of a deeper exhaustion? What if the leadership had recognized that carrier warfare, in the way that Japan had conceived and practiced it, required a level of technological parity and human resource availability that Japan could never maintain against a nation of America's industrial might? These are questions that can never be answered, of course, but they lived in the margins of military scholarship for decades, quiet speculations about roads not taken. What was certain was that the Philippine Sea marked a threshold. After June 1944, Japanese carrier task forces would continue to exist on the organization charts of the Imperial Navy. Ships would be designated as carriers, Aircraft would be assigned to them, pilots would attempt to fly from their decks, but the concept of a viable carrier task force, capable of delivering decisive force through aircraft action, had died in those 3 days of battle. What remained was a sort of phantom limb, the appearance of capability without its substance. The Japanese Naval Command would attempt one more major carrier operation, at Leyte Gulf in October, but even that effort would see the carriers reduced to a role of secondary importance, sacrificial bait in a larger tactical scheme. The age of the carrier in Japanese naval warfare was effectively ended at the Philippine Sea. What came afterward was merely the long denouement of that ending. And this raised a question that strategists would ponder for generations: whether the decline of Japanese carrier aviation had been inevitable, or whether it had been the result of specific decisions made and unmade, paths chosen and rejected. The historians who examined the battle's aftermath found themselves divided on this question. Some argued that once the initial advantage of surprise and training had been lost, essentially by the time of Midway in 1942, Japan's naval aviation was on an irreversible trajectory toward obsolescence. The gap could only widen. Others suggested that different resource allocations, different training priorities, perhaps even different strategic thinking in the years before 1944 might have produced different outcomes. It was, they acknowledged, speculation rooted in historical facts, but not susceptible to proof. What was not speculation was the impact on doctrine. The Japanese Navy, in the months following the Philippine Sea, began to shift its strategic thinking in ways both obvious and subtle. There was a renewed emphasis on battleship operations, as if the Navy were trying to return to the pre-war orthodoxy, where capital ships remained the decisive weapons. There were increasingly desperate experiments with new types of aircraft, new tactics, new methods of deploying what remained of the carrier fleet. But beneath all of these adjustments ran a current of resignation, a sense that the fundamental equation governing the war had shifted irrevocably away from Japan's favor. The battle had revealed something about the nature of industrial warfare that went beyond the specific question of Japanese naval aviation. It had demonstrated that in a conflict between nations of vastly different industrial capacity, technological advantage, and access to resources, courage and skill, and spiritual resolve, the very things that Yamato Damashi was meant to embody, could only delay the inevitable. They could not prevent it, and perhaps most painfully, they could not even make it close. When the tallies were counted, when the losses were assessed, the margin of victory was so vast that it suggested almost a different category of conflict entirely. The men in Tokyo who studied these reports, who read the casualty lists, who saw the damage assessments of the ships that had returned, understood that the mobile fleet as a concept had been destroyed. The surviving ships could be repaired, or replacements built. But the doctrine that had guided their use, the belief in the supreme capability of Japanese naval aviation, the confidence that superior training could overcome inferior numbers, all of this had been shattered as thoroughly as the decks of the Taiho when that fatal explosion occurred. In the years that followed the war, military historians would return again and again to the Philippine Sea, examining it from every angle, trying to extract lessons that might apply to future conflicts. What they most often found was a case study in the limits of human factors in warfare. No amount of individual skill, no depth of training, no reservoir of courage could fundamentally alter the outcome when one side possessed overwhelming industrial advantage and the capacity to field new pilots faster than the other side could train them to competence. It was a lesson that seemed almost too simple to be true, and yet the historical record supported it completely. The battle also served as a watershed in another sense. It marked the moment when questions about how to conduct the war began to be overtaken by questions about how to end it. The strategic initiative had been taken from Japan so completely, and the path forward had become so clearly defined, that what remained was not strategy in any traditional sense, but rather a long, grim working through of a predetermined conclusion. The carriers would continue to burn, the pilots would continue to die, the ships would continue to sink, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. And perhaps that was the deepest lesson that the Philippine Sea offered to those willing to see it. Victory in warfare depends not only on the skill and courage of those who fight, but on the capacity of a nation to sustain and replenish that skill and courage across months and years and entire campaigns. Japan had learned this lesson too late, and the learning had cost it the Pacific. In the decades that followed, historians and survivors alike would ask themselves a question that seemed to grow quieter with each passing year. What remains of a fleet when the waves have claimed it? The Philippine Sea, in its slow and patient way, became a vast cemetery where steel and memory intertwine beneath the surface, where pressure and salt water work together to transform human ambition into rust and sediment. The Taiho, once the pride of Ozawa's force, rests now on the seafloor where she sank that June afternoon, her hull broken open as though the ocean itself had exhaled a final, decisive breath. The Shokaku, that veteran of Pearl Harbor and 100 engagements across the Pacific, lies not far distant, surrounded by the scattered remains of her air group and the personal effects of men who never left her decks. If one could descend to those depths today, past the thermocline where light dissolves into perpetual twilight, one might find photographs still in pockets, letters never sent, the small tokens that men carry into battle and leave behind as unintended offerings to the abyss. The American submarines that dealt the killing blows to those carriers, Albacore, Kavala, and their sister boats, became, in a way, the true architects of June 19th's outcome, though their names are rarely spoken in the same breath as those of the fleet admirals or the fighter pilots. They operated in silence and darkness, where heroism finds no witness and recognition comes only through the cold arithmetic of naval history. The officers who commanded them filed reports that were filed away, and their sacrifice, like so much of the undersea war, remained largely unknown to the world above. Yet their actions that day were among the most consequential of the entire Pacific campaign, though the weight of that consequence was not visible in the smoke or the flames, but rather in the sudden, irrevocable shifting of naval power in that theatre. There is something both humbling and strangely peaceful in contemplating how history's greatest turning points often pass almost unnoticed in the moment, known only in their full significance long after the water has stilled. The men who survived that battle, those who were pulled from the sea or who returned with their ship intact, carried with them memories that would fade and sharpen in alternating cycles throughout their remaining years. Some would speak of what they witnessed, filling journals with careful handwriting and pencil sketches of the battle formations they had seen. Others would choose silence, sensing perhaps that some experiences resist translation into language, that the gulf between having been there and attempting to convey that presence is simply too wide to bridge. The ocean, which had nearly claimed them, became also a kind of comfort in memory. The sound of waves against a shore would return them momentarily to those days, to the specific quality of the salt-filled air, or the particular resonance of an engine room vibrating beneath their feet. Survivors from both navies, should they have ever met in the decades of peace that followed, might have found themselves speaking of the same phenomenon, the way that proximity to death at sea seems to sharpen one's senses to the natural world, to make the rhythms of wind and current feel almost like language. Historians, examining the wreckage of this engagement from the comfortable distance of time, have tended to focus on what it meant, what it signified for the broader trajectory of the war. The phrase, "Turkey Shoot," entered the lexicon, a term that would define the battle in the American historical consciousness and become shorthand for overwhelming superiority and inevitable Japanese defeat. Yet such terminology, while militarily accurate, seems to obscure something more fundamental about what actually occurred: a meeting of two societies, each operating according to its own logic and assumptions, each convinced of the righteousness of its cause, each containing within itself the seeds of its own undoing. The Japanese carriers that went to battle that June day were captained and crewed by men who believed they were defending their homeland, who had been educated in codes of honor that seemed to them as natural as breathing, who had watched their empire expand year after year only to see it begin its long contraction. The American pilots who shot them down were equally convinced of their righteousness, equally bound by the certainties of their own culture and moment. Both sides were, in a sense, prisoners of historical forces far larger than any individual decision or act of bravery. What remains to us now, 7 decades later, is not the certainty that one side was right and the other wrong, but rather a more complex understanding of how human beings conduct themselves when caught within the machinery of total war. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, viewed from the Japanese perspective that we have traced across these hours, becomes a meditation on the futility of material disadvantage overcome by spiritual conviction, on the ways that training and experience can be burned away by attrition, on the subtle mechanics through which an empire loses the capacity to defend itself. It is not a tragedy in the classical sense, because tragedy requires a certain equality between the protagonist and the forces arrayed against him, a proportionality that makes the fall seem almost inevitable in retrospect. Instead, it feels more like watching a sunset, beautiful, even in its decline, and accompanied by the quiet recognition that this too shall pass, that light diminishes not through malice, but through the simple turning of the earth. The ocean itself has perhaps the most serene perspective on all of this. The water that received the ships and men of both navies in June 1944 has continued its slow circulation, mixing and stirring, carrying salt and sediment in patterns governed by moon and sun and the planet's rotation. It has no memory, or perhaps it has too much memory. Every ship that sinks, every life that is surrendered to its depths, becomes part of a vast and unbroken continuity, stretching back to the beginning of navigation itself. The Japanese whalers who sailed these waters centuries before understood something of this immensity. The traders and explorers who charted the Pacific in the age of sail knew that the sea was indifferent to their ambitions. Yet each generation seems to arrive at this realization anew, as though it could not simply be passed down, but had to be learned again through direct encounter with that vast expanse of water. There is a peculiar kind of peace that comes from contemplating a completed action that cannot be undone or revised. The battle happened, the ships sank, the men died or survived. History recorded it, imperfectly and with all the biases of the victors, but recorded it nonetheless. What cannot be recovered is not the facts themselves, but the lived experience of those who were present, the precise quality of fear in a pilot's chest as he rolled toward his target, the particular smell of oil and smoke in a damaged compartment, the exact tenor of the last words spoken between friends before an explosion. These things dissolve into the past like salt dissolving in water, and no historical research, no matter how meticulous, can ever reconstruct them with perfect fidelity. There is something almost restful in accepting this, in recognizing that some things are meant to be lost, that the ocean, in claiming the physical vessels and scattering the human lives, was also performing a kind of mercy, removing these things beyond the reach of further suffering or revisionism. The Japanese Navy, after the Philippine Sea, would continue to fight for another year. Ships would be built, pilots trained in ever more accelerated programs that sacrificed quality for quantity. Battles would be fought, some victories, more defeats, and gradually the perimeter of Japan's defensive sphere would contract year after year until there was nowhere left to retreat to. The men who survived June 1944 would witness this slow contraction, and many would wonder, as men in such circumstances always do, whether a different outcome that day might have changed the ultimate trajectory. Historians have generally concluded that Operation Eigo represented Japan's last genuine chance for a decisive naval victory, the final moment when the weight of American production and manpower had not yet become so overwhelming that no tactical brilliance could offset it. After the Philippine Sea, the mathematics of the Pacific War had shifted irreversibly. Japan would fight with increasing desperation, but the question of ultimate defeat had essentially been answered. Yet to those who study the battle with care, who read the accounts of survivors, and examine the documents that remain, something else seems to emerge, a recognition that the men involved on both sides were, in their own ways, doing what their societies had prepared them to do. There is no blame to assign here, or rather, all blame dissolves into the larger currents of history and culture and the tragic machinery of industrialized warfare itself. The young pilots who flew to their deaths that day were not victims of their officers' poor decisions alone, but of a global catastrophe that had been unfolding for years before any of them were born. Understanding this does not diminish their sacrifice, but rather places it within a larger context where sacrifice itself seems less like a noble choice and more like the inevitable consequence of large historical